What's good, guys? Solomon here. I hope you guys are having a great day. I wanted to start off by saying thank you. Thank you for making this series what it is. Today is my 100th Hippopotamus Defense video on this channel. 100 videos is a lot. I haven't even made close to that for any other opening, so 100 is by far in first place in terms of openings covered on this channel. And yeah, I just appreciate you guys a ton. I appreciate the thousands of you that have been watching the content and following it and giving feedback. Those of you that have been commenting, I appreciate the hundreds of you that have invested in the Hippopotamus Defense course, over 6 hours of content. And in today's video, as a thank you, I wanted to go over 20 subscriber games. So we're going to be going over 20 games that you guys sent in. We're going to be going over good moves, bad moves, great moves, horrible moves, and just covering, okay, what in the Hippopotamus Defense works and what doesn't. And we're not just going to be looking at the hippo, but we're going to be looking at later stages in games as well, right? The middle game, the end game. Even if you don't play the hippo in this video, there's a lot of, lessons, general feedback, general tips and tricks that you can use in your games to just take your game to the next level. So I hope you guys enjoy it a ton. It's a long one, but this might be one of those ones that you just got to have playing in the background, or maybe you got to, take a few times to watch through it. But I do hope you guys enjoy this. And just a quick reminder that until the end of this year, if you want 30% off on my Hippopotamus Defense course, you have until the end of this year to plug in the discount code 2024 and you will receive 30% off. Just go down link below, right? Either one, pinned comment or in the description. Go to the link, go to the discount code section, plug in 2024. And if you do that before it hits 2025, you will get 30% off. Again, thank you guys a ton for your support. I've had so much fun making this series, and I hope you guys enjoy this 100th video. The first game we're going to be taking a look at comes from my guy, Rob, a private student of mine, as well as, a supporter of my Patreon page. Appreciate Rob a ton for that. In this game here, he's playing as black, and he faces this move d4, and here we have the move of g6 and bishop g7. That's usually how I start my games. Now, against knight c3, here I would usually play something like d6, but Rob goes with the move of b6. And again, guys, when we're talking about the Hippopotamus Defense, I've talked about this in a lot of videos, right? I made 99 before this one. And at the end of the day, we're just trying to get our structure. We're trying to get those two fiend-coated bishops, those two tucked knights, and then 4, 5, or 6 pawns on the 6th rank, depending on our opponent's structure. But one pro of this, one good thing about b6 is that, look, we don't got to be worried about g3, because if you do that, well, bishop b7, you can't even play bishop g2 right away. So we are going to get both of our bishops fiend-coated. b6 guarantees that. So that's a pro of that. Bishop f4, we now have both bishops fiend-coated. d6, knight d7, e6, this is all great. Knight e7, good move. g4, and now this idea of h6, good move there. a3, and here the move of g5. I do want to mention that the engine likes this move of g5. The engine also likes this move of f5. Breaking towards the king's side, attacking g4, attacking e4. It might seem like, gosh, white has a lot of, pressure on that pawn, but if white wants to take, go ahead, take all day long. At the end of the day, you're just activating our bishop more. You're allowing our knight to come to f5, and in this case, the knight on f3 is pinned to the rook. On top of that, we got a knight and a bishop really clamping down on that central d4 pawn. Here, I would like a move like queen f6, just adding more pressure, more tension, and if bishop d3, we could even castle queenside. Castle queenside here. Where is this king on e1 gonna be safe? I don't know. You can't castle either way. We're very close to potentially breaking the e file open. The g and f files are open and semi-open files. And if you just look at our piece activity, I mean, it's through the roof right now. So that is a move that is definitely worth considering in this kind of position. But we see the move of g5, another strong option. Bishop g3. I usually would tuck my knight here to g6 to really just get some good coverage on those dark squares. But we see in the game here this move of a6, another solid move. Now, I usually avoid this kind of idea against a pawn on c4 unless I'm trying to break with c5. But of course here, the move c5, we don't even really consider it much at all because there is a bishop staring towards that d6 pawn, right? If you have a bishop staring towards d6, don't even think about it. Here in the game, we have the move of b4 and now f5, right? f5, very fun break here. I mean, Rob here just breaking open the king side and d5. Notice what white just did here. This is a very common theme that I've seen again and again in the hippo. White going, you know what? That bishop's very annoying. It's very strong. If I'm playing from the white perspective, my knight is pinned to my rook. Right? How do I fix that? Well, let me play the move d5, and now that bishop's terrible. Well, true. That's true. But you just created another problem. Now our bishop on g7 is fantastic. You can't really stop both bishops from being active by a single pawn push. You can deactivate one, but oftentimes you're going to be activating the other. And in this case, we have the move of f4. Very nice push by Rob, just really kicking that bishop back to h2. Now we see knight g6. Beautiful maneuver there. Queen e7 with check. And white here's got to be careful. In the game, we have the move of knight e6, which, you know, even after that, we are winning as black. But that is the best try that white has. I mean, if you play queen e2, thanks for the knight that's hanging on d4. And we're going to capture back with the king or the knight, and we're just up a piece. We're up a piece. What are you doing? Knight d2, f3. Guess what? That knight's not going to make it. It's just not. If you bring the other knight back, we can take and then play the move f3. And taking on h8, we do have that rook covered. We have good chemistry among our pieces. It's just hard for white to really do anything there. If a move like bishop e2, same idea. We're not going to play f3 right away because the knight would take. So get rid of that knight. Now you're able to play f3, and you're in business. And finally, if the king runs... All right, bishop takes d4, we're up a piece. So in the game here, we have knight e6, and now knight gf8. This might look passive, but it's anything but. By doing this, you got a knight and a queen attacking a pinned knight, and this pawn on d5 is technically a defender for that knight, but just as that knight is pinned to the king, that pawn is pinned to the rook. Queen e2 is played. Rob plays a great move here. Knight takes e6. If white decided to take with the pawn, well, we win the rook. And sure, you can take her knight, but at the end of it, we're up 3 points in material. We're up a pawn and the exchange, and these queens are going to be falling off the board pretty soon. So we have a extremely one endgame, very easy endgame there going forward. So in the game here of queen takes e6, but even after that, Rob takes the queen, captures off the rook, and after he takes d7, we have king captures back, knight d5, bishop f3, and from this point, very solid endgame play from Rob, you know, just playing solid chess, trading down when possible, taking the rook, taking the knight, capturing off a3, h4, capturing back, king e2, pushing the pawn. Okay, it's in this kind of position, guys. Don't just try to play heroic chess and start pushing this pawn like crazy and make it a race and try to play fancy chess. Just take the freaking pawn. Take the pawn on g5, play the safe move. There's no shame in just taking the pawn and then continuing to push. We don't want to give our opponents any chances. There's no good reason for that, right? When you're up this much material, play safe. Don't let them promote. If you need to play 2, 3, 4 defensive moves to stop a pawn, do it, and then win, right? That's the idea here, and that's exactly what we see Rob do. Calmly take the pawn, and then just start pushing that a-pawn like crazy. There's really no good way to stop it. And in the game here, we have c4. I do think, yeah, I mean, black could just promote there, but a win's a win, right? I mean, when you're pushing both pass pawns down the board, you really can't go wrong in a position like this. The king here activating on dark squares is really nice. And I like what Rob did here. I don't know if this is on purpose. I'm assuming it was. But every single pawn, piece, king, you get it, is on a dark square, which really renders this bishop on e4 to be absolutely useless. This bishop can't do anything to our current piece placement, which is part of the reason I don't like playing with bishops in the endgame, at least if I have one of them. If I have two, great. If I have one, it can be pretty annoying when I'm facing a player like Rob who's doing this with all of these, you know, dark squared placed pieces. So king takes c3 is played. We finally see a pawn pushed to a light square, but then we just promote to a queen, and yeah, white resigns the game here. Very nice game by Rob, and that really highlights the idea, right? That when you're playing the Hippopotamus Defense, you know, an opening that got me to the National Master title, again, playing it as both white and black, for both colors exclusively, your opponent oftentimes will go, you know what, that bishop's really annoying. I'm going to push my pawn. I'm going to lock that bishop up. But then our other bishop is fantastically placed. For game number 2, we got my guy Ronald playing as the black pieces. Ronald is another supporter of my Patreon page and has really become a good friend of mine. We've been able to talk over email about a bunch of different subjects, including the Hippopotamus Defense. And Ronald here shows off some pretty good ideas. So we see the move e4, and now we have 1, 2, and 3. Now, I don't usually play e6. I don't usually recommend e6, but in this kind of position, Ronald couldn't have done any better, right? Playing the move of d6 there, it's not always good. If your opponent is trying to play some, you know, scholar's mate type chess and checkmate you right away, well, guess what? Queen takes f7, you're not going to get checkmated, but you are going to get your king kind of tossed around all over the place, and you can lose the bishop, and this is just resignable off the spot. So the bishop on c4, right? If the queen's not there, let's say white has a knight on c3, okay, we can just play d6. Like, taking on f7 there is not a threat. But in this case, queen takes f7, or technically bishop takes f7. Neither of those moves are very fun for us. So what do we do here? Lock that bishop down. No shame in that, right? Block the bishop out, and then the very next move, play d6, boom. You're back to a normal game. You're back to a normal game, okay? And a lot of a lot of, Hippo players, a lot of, players that play kind of offbeat openings might find themselves in trouble a little bit when it comes to queen threats and all that kind of stuff. Just remember, assess the threat and stop the threat. That's all you got to do. The queen can attack all the stuff it wants to. Most of it's probably defended if you're developing well, but if there is something threatened, just shut it down and keep developing in a normal fashion. Okay, we don't got to change our game plan here just because there's a queen on f3. Let's just keep going with our hippo kind of game, castling kingside a6, and now this idea of b5. Okay, now every hippo player kind of varies a little bit in terms of their approach to this. I used to really love playing b5, kicking that bishop around. Now I'm a little bit more quiet with doing that oftentimes, unless my opponent has committed to castling one way or the other. I kind of like to, not really commit myself to expansion on one side of the board until I know where that king is going to land. Usually, however, there's nothing wrong with this. Hikaru Nakamura, obviously a much better player than me. He has a lot of games with the Hippopotamus Defense in online chess. And I actually have a video on how that's his favorite opening because, that's what we see him play the most in online chess. And he goes with this idea all the time, right? Playing b5, kicking a piece around, just advancing very quickly on the queen side. So that's a very good move there, b3. And here we have the move castling kingside, another great move by Ronald there. Now, I do want to mention bishop b7. This might seem like a good idea, but we got to be careful about a potential, trick, trap, whatever you want to call it, against the Hippopotamus Defense. And that's when you have a knight and a bishop eyed towards a pawn on e6 or sometimes a pawn on d6. In this case, white could have played bishop takes e6 if Ronald made the mistake of bishop b7, which he didn't. But white here has this idea of bishop takes. Not knight takes first, but bishop takes. Whole idea being if we capture back, the knight takes, and guess what? We are forked right now. Once we move our queen, check, and our king can't even go take that knight here because the queen is taking away f7 and f8. So, we can play a move like king d8, but queen f6. We can act like we're, taking a pawn off with no, kind of consequences, but we are. Knight e6 check, we lose our rook. This is bad. Okay, so when you have a knight and a bishop aimed towards a pawn, which doesn't happen too often, white has to get their knight to a very strange spot, right? Like f4, or bring their knight to g5, and oftentimes the knight can't even think about doing that because we just kick it right out or prevent it from going there altogether. But whenever you see that, just be careful. Just be careful not to, make the mistake of committing. I think another move here that would be a big mistake potentially is a move like knight to d7. But in this current kind of piece placement, there's a queen on f3, right? Usually taking horrible, right? We lose the pawn, and then our queen's trapped. But in this case, we can play knight e5 with tempo against the queen, and the bishop gets involved. So this queen on f3 there in that case kind of helps us out. But again, in the game here, we have castling kingside, d4 is played, bishop b7, right? With the bishop there, it just doesn't make sense for white to take. And after knight d2, we have knight d7. Now here, white didn't take, but now it's not even a good idea for them to do that because when we capture back, that knight is pinned. You can take our pawn, but we capture off your queen. Pretty interesting here at the end of this. We end up, in the main kind of line here, best moves for black, that is down material. We're down material. We have 2 extra minor pieces. White has an extra rook and 2 extra pawns. We're technically down material, but when we're talking about material, usually it's just cut and dry. Oh, you're down material. Oh, you're worse. Oh, you're up material. You're winning. But when it comes to minor pieces and a rook, or a rook and a pawn, or a rook and 2 pawns, it gets a little bit dicey. And the favor definitely usually goes towards the 2 minor pieces, especially if it's just a rook. Nearly always if it's a rook and a pawn. If it's a rook and 2 pawns like this position, then it gets a little bit more dicey, a little bit harder to evaluate. But even the engine here gives over -1 for black. It's just hard when your opponent has 4 minor pieces flying all over the place and you only got 2. So going back to knight d7, white did not capture on e6. We instead see the move of bishop to c2, and here the idea of e5. Okay, e5, solid move there. I think c5 is another good idea here, just really going after the weak pawn on d4. But here we have the move e5, which does that as well. We're kicking that knight, and we're also attacking the pawn on d4. Knight d5 is played. Here we have capturing off and the move of e4. Now, I do think this is a mistake. I think better is capturing on d4, right? Get your pawn. And the engine says play bishop b6. Honestly, guys, when I get my pawn, I just run the heck back. Get back to your spot. Generally, that's the best move most of the time. And even here, I think practically, it makes for a more smooth game. We don't got to be as worried about a bishop running into h6 and giving us issues. we're able to play chess without having to worry so much about those kingside attacks. So I'd just bring my bishop back. Again, we're over -1 here. We're up a pawn. We have a great game. D5 is extremely weak, and it's isolated, and it's attacked by a bishop with queen in its vision. So yeah, I mean, in this case, I would recommend just taking off that pawn, but we see the move E4. After queen takes, the move of knight F6, kicking that queen around, and now the move bishop takes D5. Great coordination between black's pieces here. Rook E8 is played. Now we have the move queen D7, just continuing to develop. F3 and bishop H6. Bishop H6 is a good move. What I would say is that before that, playing the move of knight H5 would be a good idea. I think this is a good move. Now we're threatening to trap that queen. Can anything really stop our knight from going in to F4? Well, you could push the pawn to F4, but then you're really weakening your position. I mean, a move like queen G4, we're threatening mate. A bishop is very active there. The knight's still pouncing on F4. That's not great. And if you play G3, well, now you've pushed pawns in front of your king. And overall, your position is just a little bit more loose. Your light squares are a little bit more weak. Now we can play the move bishop H6, which threatens to trap the queen. And that's what we see right away, the move bishop H6 threatening rook E3, trapping that queen. But I think throwing knight H5 in there first is a little bit better. But still here, black has a much better game. H3 is played. White misses this. Now we throw a rook in. Right, Ronald finds that move, rook E3. We see trading off. Bishop takes D2. The rook flying over to E8, and yeah, I mean, from this point, this game's pretty much over. You just gotta play some solid chess from that point. And yeah, technically you have a mate in one, but we have the move rook E2 check. A win's a win, a mate's a mate. Even when you throw in the check, white's got a block, and yeah, Ronald finishes this game out in nice fashion. Next up, for our third Hippopotamus Defense game, we got another one by one of my other private students, Joshua. Very strong player, as you can see here, pushing 2,000 in terms of rating in this game. And we see Josh going up against this move D4, in which case we have 1, 2, and 3. This is exactly how I personally get into the move order. Again, not the only way, but this is how I do it, right? Often playing 4, 5, and then here I'll go B6 or knight D7. But yeah, I mean, we finish out in a nice fashion here. We have the move of A6, E5 is played, and now D5. Now, one thing to take away from this video, if you see the move of D5, or really if you're playing either color, right? If you see the D pawn push against you, lock it up. If you see the E pawn push against you, think about it. Oftentimes, it's not the best idea to lock it up. Sometimes it is, especially if your opponent's king is on the queen side and you can very quickly advance on that side of the board. But in this case, I don't think D5 is the best option. Sometimes taking is actually a good move. Sometimes your bishop can fly in and mess things up. Obviously, in this case, no pawn structure is going to get messed up unless they take with the pawn, which wouldn't make any sense. I mean, you got so many different options there that are better. But here, taking on E5 is the best move. Now, in the game, we have the move of D5, but capturing here, we actually go up material. Just keep in mind that you really got to eye your queen on D8 towards hanging pieces. This bishop on D3 is hanging, and this is why this kind of stuff matters, guys. This is why it matters. You might look at this position and think, oh, that bishop is very locked in. It's hanging, but who cares? There's so much in the way here. But in the game of chess, stuff can fly out of the way very quickly, right? In a moment's notice. And that's generally why, you know, we recommend, in fact, the late Eric Schiller, my old chess coach, taught me to aim my rooks towards my opponent's king and or queen for this kind of reason. So in this case, taking on E5 is the best move. Let's just say the knight takes. Well, we take again. And if you take with the D pawn, thanks for the bishop. If you capture with the pawn, we take. Right now, we're up a pawn, guys. We're up a pawn. And if you decide to take our bishop, we take yours. We're up material here. We're winning. And if the pawn takes, same kind of thing. We take with the knight. Again, you can take our knight. You're up a piece for our pawn, but only for a brief moment, because we're just going to take your bishop. And if the knight takes, we capture back. And yet again, same kind of position, same kind of line. We're doing great here. So in this position, taking on E5 is a great idea. And I would say, generally speaking, too, if your opponent plays E5 and captures on D6, that's not the end of the world. In fact, oftentimes we get a lot of benefits from that. Let's just say we castle and we see E takes E6. Let's capture towards the center. What did white get out of this? Well, really the only thing I can think of is that they got this E file for their rook or queen. Sure, cool. But our pawn on E6 is very well guarded. I'm not too worried about it. What did we get? A C file. Now in this case, the pawn on C3 is also well defended, but there's a lot of positions where this isn't so, and the C file is something that we could take great advantage of. And even now, I do think that the C file is more valuable than the E file at this moment. On top of that, by pushing and taking, you got rid of a central E pawn for a C pawn. right? And we both captured on d6. So we have a great central presence, 2 pawns on the center E and D files. White only has 1. And on top of that, by pushing that pawn and taking, you've weakened squares like f5 and d5. We can take advantage of this. A move like knight f6 is nice. We have a little bit more space to maneuver with our queen. This is just a very solid, nice position for black to work with, and the engine says that black is better. But in the game here, we have the move of d5 and c5. Now, if you do get this locked up kind of structure, we have a French defense kind of structure here in the center. Start putting pressure on that pawn. Great move from Josh there, putting pressure on d4. Against the move of a4, we have knight c6, continuing to build the pressure, and white here takes. Not a good idea. If you're playing white in a position like this, guys, keep your pawn structure intact. That's what you got to work towards. The moment you take, e5 often gets a little bit weaker. Now, in this case, it's not necessarily because of the pawn on f4, defending it, but even then, we capture back with the pawn. Again, another good move by Josh. Because really, the general piece of advice that I give is look to the sides of the pawn. When you play a flank pawn push, look to the sides. Is there a black pawn there? Yeah? Okay, take with a pawn. Generally, that's the best idea, including here. We're wiping out half of the 4th rank. And sure, you got a bishop looking at squares like this. You got a knight looking at d4, a knight looking at e4 and c4, but it doesn't matter because the pawns protect them. g4 is played. We now have the move of queen to b6 activating. Solid play there. And now this move of c4, kicking the bishop back, a5. I think that h5 there is probably, a move that we really got to think about. But we see at the very next turn, a5 and then h5 from Josh. Okay, so good play there, advancing on the king side of the board. This is a good way in general to slow down your opponent's advancement. And whether it's on the king side or queen side, right? Think about pushing your A or H pawns. You might even want to write that down. When you see your opponent advancing like crazy on the king side or queen side, think about pushing your A or H pawn. They're on the edge of the board. And when you push those pawns, you're only weakening 1 square. Most pawns, when you push them, like this D pawn here, you're weakening 2 squares. Technically, when you make the first move of the game and you play D5, technically E6 and C6 are weaker. But when you push the H pawn, only 1 square is weaker. So they're more expendable for that reason. It's easier to push them without feeling the consequences for that reason. And in this case, let's say white pushes. Well, guess what? White's just kind of done on the king side now. This pawn cannot move. This pawn cannot move. This pawn, you can move it, but we have a double pawn clamp there with g6 and e6, so that's going to be hard to pull off in any good way. This pawn, push it all you want, but you're going to get stuck. So white's king side advancement is out the window now. Black, on the other hand, we have a lot of play on the queen side of the board. Going back, let's say white takes, we take back. We don't want to just think about the current position. We want to think about potentiality in terms of pawn breaks, in terms of playing actively in. Again, when you look at white's pawn structure, it's just kind of locked down. There's not much white can do on the king side now. And if the move of h3 is played, we can take. White would love to take with the pawn, but you can't. So this kind of ends up in a similar situation. Maybe we castle queenside. This is another great thing about the Hippo. It's dynamic. If you keep your king in the center for a little bit, you can go one way and then go, you know what? I'm just going to start attacking on the king side. Rook h5, swing this over to, this rook over to h8, and you got a battery ram going against that pawn on h3. White here is in major trouble, and you got a bishop aimed towards that king. At some point, playing a little move like d4 and moving your knight, and we got some discovery ideas. So, yeah, honestly, I think that black's winning this position if you play it well. h5 is played, and white here goes with the move of f5. Now, in this position, the engine moves include bishop takes e5, just snatching off that pawn, getting tempo against the queen. Of course, we got knights defending that bishop, and we also got this move of knight c takes on e5 in the game. We have g takes f5, so that's not the best move, but black's still better. Black still has an advantage here. The pawn takes back, bishop takes e5, best move that black could have played. And now we have the knight, on c6 captured back. The reason we take back with the c knight in that kind of position, or part of it to say the least, is that our bishop on b7 is one step closer to getting discovery action ideas against that king. White ends up taking. d4 works in this position. It works. But then bishop e4 blocking it. So we see the move queen takes e6. Much better move. Sometimes, guys, in chess, it's good to keep the tension. In fact, when I was growing up, I went to a camp with Grandmaster Malik Kachian. I don't know if you guys have heard of him. I know he's been, doing some stuff on chess.com for forever. At least in the 2000s, he had some videos on there, just to show you my age. But yeah, he taught us about keeping the tension. Sometimes it's good to keep the tension when the tension is in your favor. And in this case, this is definitely in our favor. This whole d4 idea. White's not having fun about that. White's not having fun having to think about that every single move. but we got to unleash it at the right time, right? I think in this case, we see the move of pawn to d4, right? Maybe black could have waited a little bit longer to play that just because this isn't, a crushing move here, but it's still a good one. I'm not going to sit here and say it's not. We see that king run. Queen b6. I like that idea, especially practically. I mean, you got a queen looking at the king, a bishop looking towards g2 and h1. White here is very uncomfortable. Knight e4. And yeah, here we see the move of castling queenside. Now, this actually turned out to be a blunder because white could have played queen takes e5. That knight is pinned. White right now just got a piece. All that to say, though, sure, white's winning, but they got to play near perfect, if not perfectly, every move to keep that up. I mean, in this case, rook h8 check. The only move here that's better for white, the only move here white can play to keep an advantage, king f2. That's the only move. Here we can attack the queen again. Yet again, white only has one move here. Bishop takes d7 with check. The whole idea is that white can check and check and check and just keep checking our king, developing pieces while they do so, and therefore getting their king more defensive options. Sometimes in chess, the best defense is an attack, and on top of that, you're getting more pieces activated. But let's just say white goes, you know what? My queen's attacked. I'm just gonna run to f4 or something. Well, now we're crushing the position. Bishop takes e4. If you capture back, d takes c3 with check, and white just doesn't have the resources right now to defend well. If bishop e3, we continue chasing down that king. Notice the activity of our rooks on both of these open files. And if queen e3, knight c5, we're pouncing with, attacking that bishop on e4 that is pinned. Maybe even knight d3 is an idea. Rook g4 is an idea going after that bishop. The king here is not sitting pretty, and black's winning here. Okay, so this is still a very sharp, hard position for white to play. We see the move of c takes d4 instead, though, so white misses that idea. And now the move of queen takes d4 with check. Now, the reason this ends up being a mistake is that white could have played bishop e3, and then we just got to kind of move our queen, right? I mean, and then from here, maybe white plays a move like rook a d1. Going back, what's a better move here? Playing this bishop takes e4 first. Now, if the bishop takes back, we can play a move like rook to g8. We're looking to pin that queen. And if you save your queen, now we throw in a check. Now we throw in a check, and bishop e3 here, I mean, if you do that, we're just able to take off your queen, and you're going to lose your bishop as well, or we could take the bishop first. Either one is great. So in this case, queen takes d4. Just waiting a little bit, getting rooks activated, all that kind of stuff, getting pin ideas going. That's really going to make a difference here. Okay, and this is completely crushing. We're looking towards just snatching off that bishop. If you play rook f2, king g2, king h1, we take with check. We're going to be up 4 points in material with a crushing game for black. Okay, but again, we have this move of queen takes d4 immediately. White misses their only opportunity to get about an even game with the move of bishop e3. We see knight f2, knight f3 check. Beautiful idea. From this point, I mean, Josh doesn't really let white back into this game at all. Knight g4 is played. We have a discovery with knight e5, and it's not like the rest of this game was played perfectly by black in terms of checkmating the king as fast as, could have been, but at no point here did white not have, a mate on the way. White was always in a forced mate. We always had a forced mate coming, and this king didn't survive long. Some of y'all keep saying the hippo's not aggressive. I don't know what y'all talking about. For our fourth game out of 20 that we're going to be looking at, all coming out of the Hippopotamus Defense, we now have my guy, Walter Reed, a good friend of mine, private student, supporter of the Patreon. Big shout out to Walter for the support that he's given. But yeah, here he's playing as black, and Walter's been playing, the Hippo exclusively, quite a bit now against certain moves. And, I know for a long time we saw against d4 Walter going with the Hippo. In this game, we see the move of e4 and Walter going into a Hippo with 1, 2, and 3. Now, again, I usually don't play this third move here with e6, but in some variations, it's not the end of the world, right? In this case, if you're going to play d6 and then e6, or e6 and d6, doesn't really matter, right? But I would say that generally speaking, playing the move of d6 helps with transpositional stuff. If you're playing a very hard setup and you want to transpose into a Czech Pierce or a King's Indian defense, or you want to go into a neo-modern, all that kind of stuff. As y'all can tell, I've studied way too much opening theory out of the modern, but yeah, I think d6 overall is better. But in this case, we have e6, and that's totally fine, right? Now the move of d6, h6, white here trying to get into that spot. Don't make the mistake, guys, of playing knight e7, because then bishop h6, and that's just annoying, especially practically, right? So play h6 first, then move your knight, just like Walter did. Bishop e2, we have the move of b6, bishop e7, This is all good. And finishing things out, we got our full thick-skinned hippo, 2 knights tucked, 2 bishops fianchettoed, 6 pawns on the 6th rank, and now this move of knight cd4. In this kind of structure, what has white done? Realize white hasn't played the kind of fundamental e4, d4. If white has pawns on e3 and d4, I'll often go, you know what, if I can, I'm going to take some space with f5. If my opponent has pawns on d3 and e4, it's like, you know what, let me take some space with c5. And that's exactly what we see Walter do here. If you're going to give me space, I'll take it, sure. Knight c2 is played. In the game here, we have the move of b5, very playable move. I would say that I think, maybe slightly better could be a move like d5, pouncing against e4. We got to realize that white's setup's a little bit weird, in all honesty. I know there's been a lot of attention towards this whole queen c1, bishop d2 thing against the modern. I can't quote who made a course on it. If you know, please let me know down below so I'm aware of it. I know there's a course out there about someone covering this. This whole idea, but against the hippo in this kind of line, it didn't work out too well, especially the way that white played it. I'm not sure the exact move order that white usually goes with that queen c1 idea, but I faced it before and it's not too troublesome. But in this case, the knight's on c2. It's very oddly placed, and this pawn on e4 only has 1 defender. You only got 1 central pawn on the 4th rank, and it only has 1 defender. So we could play a move like d5, just putting pressure on it. Why not? We have supporters like our knight and our bishop ready to go. We have a pawn there as well. We could also play this move c4, looking to potentially distract the pawn, take on e4. If you want to attack our pawn, fine. We can play queen c7. We can play e5 or queen c7. If you want to keep putting pressure on it, e5, f5 advancing. You attack our bishop. All right, let's run back home. Run back to b7. And this reminds us, a little bit of a King's Indian defense. We're looking at castling kingside, knight f6, g5, f4, e4. Very quick kingside expansion here. And a lot of rich ideas. I mean, this is going to be hard for white to, play out. And the nice thing about the Hippopotamus Defense as well is your pieces often have very nice chemistry. When you figure it out, when you put the pieces together, when you study it, you got 2 fianchetto bishops that can unleash, and those bishops as well, they're not stuck on that diagonal forever. At any point, they can go to a6, c8, h6, f8, and overall, you have good piece coordination. White here, I don't know what white's doing. I'll be honest. This is tough. So going back to knight c2, though, we see this move of b5 advancing. Knight e3 is played. f5, putting pressure on the e4 pawn. I like that f5 move. That's a good option. E takes f5 here. Walter continues by capturing back with the knight. And again, usually we look to the sides. If there's a pawn there, take with a pawn. If there's nothing there, usually taking with a knight is a good idea. Here, the engine actually prefers taking with the g pawn. I think in that case, we have a very active bishop and we have a rook able to come to g8 and just a lot of, nice central pressure there as well. But in this case, knight takes f5, still very playable. We then see g takes. That's a much better move than e takes here. Because if you take with the e pawn, your king can get a little bit vulnerable. The pawn on h6 still is attacked. If you take with the g pawn, right, you have that g file to work with now if you're black, which is great. Knight e1 is played. We have queen f6, bishop f3, capturing off, castling kingside. I remember when I first started working with Walter mentioned that he was kind of scared of castling in positions like this, worried about getting attacked like crazy, but Walter's grown a lot in his understanding of defensive chess, and black is more than okay here. In this kind of position, white really has nothing, and white does continue by pushing with d4. We see the move of c4. I think slightly better there might be a move like e5, just continuing to break, continuing to make that presence known, because we do have better developed pieces in terms of activity. But we have c4, h3, and now the move of d5. Now, I would say this is a mistake. Why is that? Well, first off, what do we get out of this d5 move? I don't know if we get too much out of it. Now, sure, e4 is a little bit more strengthened, but it already was, right? e4 was already a strength of ours, and I don't think we need to double down on it at this point in the game. What weakness did we form? Well, e5's weak now. Before that, it wasn't. I mean, before that, a knight couldn't even think about going in there. But now after a move like d5, white should have played bishop f4, rook e1, just started piling up like crazy against that square. Again, guys, anytime you move a pawn in chess, squares get weakened, but you got to look at what squares are weakened and how your opponent can respond to that, right? I mean, going back to h3, here if we, instead of playing the move of d5, if we play a move like e5, sure, that makes d5 weak. But unlike e5, can white take advantage of this? Well, this knight's 2 squares diagonal. So technically speaking, even on an empty board, this is going to take the knight 4 moves to get there as fast as it can. In this kind of position, maybe you're going to try something like this, but that's just going to take way too long. The bishop can never get there. d5 is a square that white cannot take advantage of. And that's why e5 is such a strong option there. But instead we see the move d5. White misses this, and we see knight h2. And going forward, I would say that generally speaking, black, missed a few opportunities to play e5, and white kept missing opportunities to take advantage of that spot. But we see this king end up stepping to h7, right? Bringing this rook to g8. This is a common benefit of taking with the g pawn at some point. You now have a rook aimed towards the opponent's king. Queen g6 is played. Bishop f8. Better there is actually bishop takes d4, because you can't even take that bishop without getting checkmated. And if white doesn't get checkmated, okay, we got our pawn, we run back. We're good. We're good there. But okay, here we have the move bishop f8. White still misses the checkmate. And here Walter finishes things off on move 27 by capturing off on g2. Hope you got something out of that one. Next up, we got a game from my youngest student, Luke, 6 years old. Last year played in the national championships and got 6 out of 7, tying for second place, all while playing nothing but the Hippopotamus Defense as both white and black. Great kid. Seems to really be enjoying the game of chess, which is awesome. I know when I was growing up, I really enjoyed the game, and it's just awesome to see a kid growing up enjoying it. He's also been improving a ton as well. I mean, in online chess, he's getting close to 1600 at such a young age. And yeah, he's really doing well with the Hippo. So here in this game, as you can see, he's going up against a 1700. He ends up winning this game with the Hippo as white. Let's take a look. So we got 1, 2, and 3. This is all textbook. Knight d2, e3, right? This is all standard stuff. This is all great. b3, d4. And it's interesting here, right? Now, the engine actually recommends here, which is rare, us taking this pawn on d4. And I think part of that might be the fact that this knight is the only lone defender for the pawn right now. We can play bishop b2. Just keep adding pressure to that pawn on d4 as much as possible. But all that to say, Luke here plays the move of e4, and I would have done the exact same thing. I love this kind of position for white. We see this move of knight to e7. And here, I would recommend the move of pawn to f4. Okay, this is a very important move to get in. You want to look at these pawns once it's locked up, and you want to see which one is further away from us, which one is weaker, and the one that's weaker is going to be further away, right? The base of the pawn chain. e5 defends d4. d4 does not defend e5, so we should play a move there like pawn to f4, put pressure on that e5 pawn. We're also looking at f5 ideas as well, and if black decides to take, we can capture back with our g-pawn. We got pawns side by side, wiping out half of the 5th rank. We're currently looking at, potentially throwing in an e5 move, getting a fork, and f5 can be played as well. And on top of that, by black taking here, well, d4 is a bigger weakness. Great game for white, right? Great game there for us. So when we do see that move of knight e7 again, I would personally play the move of f4. And later on, maybe we play f5 and g4. But here in the game, we see the move of g4. And now it's going to be a little bit harder. In fact, maybe impossible to pull this move of f4 off because we don't have a pawn supporting it. Black here takes advantage of that by playing this move of knight to g6. We see knight f3 from Luke, c5, and now the move of knight g3. The knight jumps in. Get rid of it. I like that. Get rid of the knight. And now this move of knight e2. I think knight f5 may have been a little bit more aggressive, but both knight f5 and knight e2, right? Both of these are playable moves here. In fact, knight e2 might be a little bit more sound. So we see the move of b5 here, black expanding. Now here, Luke missed a tactic, and black did as well. It actually happened a couple times here. Here the tactic is playing pawn to e5. Pawn to e5, and the bishop and the knight are forked. We're going to go with material, and because of that, we have a 1 game. But instead we have this move of queen d2. a5 is played. Black misses it. Again, Luke misses this move of e5. We have capturing off on f4. And now Luke is up a pawn with a good position. a4 is played. And now we have g5. I would say that this is a mistake. And it actually, the evil actually flips into black's favor now because black can play this move of knight to h5. I know that the knight on the rim is dim, but when we push our pawns like this and we kick a knight off to that square, that means that there's weaknesses. By definition, when you push your pawn super far, you make weaknesses, and we see that here. If you push a G-pawn all the way up, well, guess what? A pawn's on E4, a pawn's on G5, F4 is a weakness. This is a dark square that black can take advantage of, not to mention that this knight is kind of just holding up our entire kingside expansion. So yeah, I mean, I think going back, right, instead of playing G5 there, maybe castling kingside here is the way to go. But we see the move G5, knight H5, the queen runs, G6 here defending the knight. Knight D2 is played. I think that, castling kingside is a good idea there, because if black takes here, we want to be able to take with our A pawn. We want to keep our pawn structure intact, and we want to have our rook being able to defend that rook on A1. But instead we see knight D2. Now when black takes, we can't take with the A pawn unless we want to lose our rook. So we see this move of C takes B3, but now two things happen that are not in our favor. Number one, A2, still a big old target, right? It's not like that pawn has shifted over to B3. On top of that, D3 is a weakness now that that black can definitely look to put pressure on, and maybe even play C4 at some point and just start breaking through. So we see the move H6, F4 is played. Good move there from Luke, expanding, protecting that pawn. H takes is played. We see F takes back. I would say here to Luke, hey, you're up material. You're up material. On top of that, your king is less safe than black's. Both of those point towards us trading down. I would definitely recommend queen takes G5 there. But we have F takes, king G7. Here the move bishop F3. Rook comes over. We see capturing off. Black gets their material back. Rook G1. A check gets thrown in there. This move of knight F1. Rook takes H3. Now here, black is up material. Black continues to play, solid chess. They keep their advantage here. C4, rook, rook H2 could be played there, but we instead see the move C takes D3. And the king captures back. And this king kind of gets thrown around a little bit by checks, right? Rook H2. Now we have two rooks on the second rank, and A4 is played. Now here, black should have went with the move of bishop H3, right? That's a a very important kind of move there. Again, in this kind of position, when you have that pawn on A4, we're sitting at even material. Black needs to really play a move like bishop H3, chase down our king. And here we got to play a move like knight G2, which simply gives our knight up. And if we play a move like king E1, on the other hand, which is a lot worse, well, we just lose the game on the spot, right? So we'd have to give up our knight. So black misses that idea against A4. We instead see this move of rook D to E2. And black then takes on G2. It seems as if black is winning here, right? I mean, you have this rook pinned. The rook's putting pressure on G2. There is only one move here for white that survives. Anything else, dead lost, and Luke finds it. The only move here, bringing this A rook up one square. Beautiful. Beautiful move here, right? Only move you got. I mean, if you don't do that, you're going down material. You're going to be losing. So rook A2, black ends up capturing. We have capturing back from white as a possibility, but we see king G1 as the move instead. And that's actually a pretty good move. I mean, if you do take with the rook here, gosh, black could play a move like rook H3. We could see rook H1. And then if the king goes to F2 or E2, whatever, maybe black's going to start targeting pawns. That rook can get active. So by playing this move of king G1, you kind of keep this rook in the game over here. You're still going to win the bishop, unless, of course, the bishop saves itself and you take the rook. But yeah, I mean, the rook moves. Then you take the bishop with the king, and you still have this rook in a great position. This endgame here was played beautifully by Luke. Okay, I mean, it really shows off some good endgame chess. If black decides to take with the B pawn, are we going to take with the rook or the pawn? The pawn, right? We're going to take with the pawn there, have a passer, and push it down the board. Black ends up taking on B3. And now we have a choice to make, right? Do we want to take on B5? Do we want to push with A5? Well, we're down material here. We need to make this game crazy. We need to get fighting chances, and that's what we see Luke do here by playing this move of A5. This rook's in the way. This pawn's going to be a little bit stuck, a little bit prohibited from pushing very quickly, but this pawn on A5, we can just start racing this down the board, right? A6. A7 is played here. Great move. Now we have king activation from both sides. Both sides trying to activate their kings. Rook A5. We're looking to take with check if possible. King D6, a good move from black because black doesn't want to lose a pawn with check and then give us the ability to come back. Right now, if we take the pawn, we lose ours. But if the king's on E5, we'd get check, bring our rook back. We still have our pawn. So good move for black there. King D4 is played. B4, black trying to make some space here. But the king just ends up running over and taking it. F6 is played. I think black could have been a little bit more aggressive there by pushing this pawn and trying to distract this rook so that they could win the pawn on a7. This rook is useless right now, in a sense. I mean, it cannot move. If you move this rook anywhere along this rank, we can promote or even take the rook technically on that spot. And if you take the pawn, you lose it. So either this king has to come over and win this pawn with the rook, or this pawn has to push like crazy to distract our rook and therefore win that pawn on a7, right? So I think black could have been more aggressive here. Passed pawns must be pushed, but we see this move of pawn to f6, king b5, and black continuing to push with the g pawn. Now, g3 is played, king b7, g2, rook a1. Even in this position, right, black can actually take on a7. Black can do this, and it's going to be a draw, according to the engine. King e5, sure, we can come over here, and we can win that pawn on g2, but at the end of this, I mean, maybe something like f5, practically, that's a good idea. Our king is just too slow, and if we throw in checks with the rook, it doesn't really do much. The king just kind of keeps improving, but let's just say we throw our king in there, and we just keep trying to catch up a little bit. F3, right? Let's say the rook comes over to a2 or something. The king keeps making progress. Our king just can't really get into the action. And, if our rook comes in, the king makes progress, you get the point, right? It's going to be very hard for us. So going back to rook a1, black could have given up the rook there, and they actually would have been okay. Rooks are pretty well known for being bad at stopping pawns. If you have a queen there, not even close, right? But a rook, it's very limited in what it can do against the opponent's king. But in this case, we see the move of rook to g8. And there's a couple of different moves here, but Luke plays the best one, this move of rook to g1, stopping this pawn and now looking to promote. King e5 is played. There's only one move here that's winning. We already know that if we promote and take with the king, that black's okay there. We just don't have time to stop that pawn in a good fashion. We're going to get a draw there, having to give up that rook for the pawn. What do we have, though? Rook takes g2, looking to distract that rook. And if black takes, all right, we promote. That's great. We have a one game. Rook h8 is played. In this case here, what can we do? Well, we could promote, but then it's a draw, right? And this is what I'm talking about. Luke just shows a really nice game here in the end game. I mean, who wouldn't promote there? Not a lot of players. Promote. Oh, why not promote to a queen? All right, we're good. Oh, wait, this is going to be a draw, right? This is probably going to be a draw here. So going back, Luke realizes, wait, I don't need to do this in a rush. If I do that, I lose my pawn. This pawn pushes like crazy. Let me save my pawn and then look to promote, right? So that's what we see there. Rook h7 with check, king b6. The rook really has no choice but to go back and defend. You can't win this pawn as black now, and a trade doesn't do anything because this is your only hope. This pawn is black's only hope for a draw. Rook h8. Now we see the king start to inch a little bit closer. If you want to go to rook a8, king b7, and then we're going to promote because we get tempo on that rook. f5 is played. We now trade off, and we bring our rook here. Now, sure, black, again, they can go here, but then we bring our king in, promote, we're good. We're going to have a king and rook endgame. The rook ends up checking. We see Luke just bring that king over. The rook finally has to commit to the a8 spot, and now the king just slides over. Perfect endgame technique. You can leave your rook there, but we're going to take it, and the moment you move it, we promote to a queen, and from this point, just textbook play from white as well in terms of king and rook versus king. This game in particular, I was very impressed by Luke's endgame ability. Found so many moves that were the best one or even the only move that gave a winning position. I would say in the opening segment where we're talking about the Hippopotamus Defense, again, d4 here, the engine says take. You can do that, right? And in this kind of setup, black's pawn structure is a little bit weak and it's a little bit awkward. I mean, the bishop's in the way. You only have one defender. We're also attacking one of your defenders right now, which is the only one, as I mentioned. But this move e4, this gives us a great game, practically speaking. The thing is now, though, you want to play f4, right? G4 doesn't mean g4 is out the window forever, but play f4 first. You don't need the f pawn for g4, but you do need the g pawn for f4. And then later in the game, there was a couple of moments there, right? Like right here, we take, right? We have that fork, as you can see. But overall, once we hit that endgame segment, even at parts throughout the Hippo, especially for his age, I think Luke showed off a great game. And just big shout out to Luke for the progress you're making. Proud of you, man, and keep it up. Next up, we got a game from my guy David, a longtime supporter of this channel. Big shout out to you, brother. But yeah, David here actually plays a really nice game, a really solid game against a FIDE master by playing the Hippo Defense. And in his email to me, David explained to me initially going up against an FM, going up against a titled player, he felt a little bit, maybe a little bit intimidated just by, the fact that his opponent was titled, and also realized the fact that, look, my opponent here, because they're titled, probably knows what they're doing when it comes to mainline theory. They probably have all that figured out in terms of the opening they play, how to play it, the lines, all that kind of stuff. So here David decides to take them into less known territory and into his by playing the Hippo Defense. And that's what we see here at the very start. We see the move of G6, starting out with a modern, but very quickly here we see the Hippo, kind of structure start to emerge. D4 is played, bishop G7, knight C3, D6, F4. So far, this is how I played as black. Now here I'm recommending the move of pawn to E6. I'll cover why. In the game, David plays the move of knight to D7, and I actually think that David played very well going forward overall, coming out of this position. I will say that I myself used to get obliterated when I played this move against the 3-pawn center. Okay, and then from that point, I kind of had to figure out, what do I do? No one taught me, how to play against this, or my personal approach against it, but I just kind of plugged it into Stockfish, try to figure out what Stockfish would play, and I came out with the help of the engine with an approach that I really like, and I'll share that with you now. But yeah, here in the game, we have the move knight f3, e6, bishop d3, knight e7, and castling kingside. Now, again, I used to get obliterated in positions like this. I have, a friend, Alan, who's a national master, and he used to just wait. Whenever I played the Hippo, he'd get this set up as white, and he would just wait for my bishop to either get blocked by my knight or for my bishop to fianchetto. Didn't matter how long I freaking waited. At some point, he would play f5 when he could. And right now, we just don't have the numbers. Our bishop is not activated towards that spot. We can take, but we can't take again. We just can't. That's not a good idea. Okay, now here maybe we play a move like knight to f6 and just try to play some defensive chess there. Again, according to the engine, black's okay. I don't feel okay. I'll just say that. I don't. But yeah, we don't want to fall into taking with the knight, because we never want to count this G pawn as a defender, ever, practically speaking. This pawn structure is horrible. Look at that. We got double isolated pawns, an isolated pawn on h7. Just a very hard position to defend from the black side. Right, so taking a step back for a moment to this move f4. If you see a 3-pawn center like this on the king side, I'm not so worried about the queen side. If you see e4, d4, c4, whatever, but if you see these 3 pawns, keep your bishop with an eye on that spot. I like playing this move e6, knight e7, and then going 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Notice we still have 3 on this spot. I'm not counting this pawn. I never want to take with the G pawn. And now the very next turn, we can look towards putting 1, 2, 3 on d4. So we got 3 attackers there, 3 defenders here, and we have the numbers. Right? And there's a lot of different things that can happen here. In my over 6-hour course on the Hippopotamus Defense, I go over the theory more in depth, how to approach a position like this. But yeah, the move f5 here, it doesn't work because our bishop can see. We can take with the e pawn, capture back with the knight or the bishop. Here, I'd probably take with the bishop. Capturing back with the knight is actually it's just nice. You're attacking the bishop, attacking the centralized pawn. Black's winning now. So, again, I recommend you guys memorize that, and that's going to give you a playable game there, because I think by putting your knight on d7, you can often fall into trouble. But here, again, David, plays really solid defense here, and white doesn't go for the move of f5. We instead see the move of queen e1. Good option. Bishop b7 is played. h3. c5. Love this move. Love this move from David, striking in the center, putting pressure on d4. Knight b5 is played. And here the move c takes d4 was played. And I'm not going to say this is a blunder or anything, but I do think that here black had a great opportunity to take an advantage in the game. And it really comes down to the fact that this pawn on e4 is only defended once. When we're playing the Hippopotamus Defense, we got to keep an eye on those centralized pawns and how many defenders they have. That's going to help us realize when they're weak, when we can distract a piece, when we can distract a pawn, like we saw in that Walter game potentially. In this case, there's only one defender. How do we distract that bishop? By pushing our pawn to c4, pushing that pawn up. If the bishop takes, which, you might as well, we take on e4. What did white get out of this? I guess he got an e-file, I guess. And you got the c-pawn, but we got a pawn trade, so we're not really talking about material right now. We're talking about positional prowess, what each side got out of it, all that kind of stuff. I don't know. It just doesn't feel like white got too much out of it. White did give up a centralized pawn And because of that, f5 and d5 are weak. By the way, in this kind of position, if we see a move like knight takes on d6, we can end up capturing on f3, playing queen c7. The knight's attacked, the bishop's attacked. You can try to hang on to both with queen b4. We kick the queen around. And if a move like queen to a3, we capture on d4. This is a great game for black. Absolutely fantastic. So let's say white doesn't go for that. We see a move like rook c1. All right, we play knight f6. Whenever you see a pawn capture on d6, your queen does a great job of covering d6 and b6. You have that knight f6 spot available. If your bishop gets attacked, bring it back. You have a knight looking at f5. You have a very active bishop, but both knights looking towards d5. And because white took, or really in this case, white didn't take, right? Because we took that pawn on e4, f5 can't be played. Right, and that's great for us. So going back, I think that c4 is a great idea there. Anytime that we can take that pawn on e4, or if white takes, f5 is just harder to pull off because a pawn doesn't support that pawn push. And we have a double pawn clamp on that spot. Pawns are the best defenders in chess, the best supporters in chess, because they're expendable. And yeah, this pawn on e4 is very important in terms of pulling f5 off. So distracting that pawn somehow is a great idea. But okay, we have the move here, c takes d4. Knight c5, bringing that knight out, right, activating that minor piece. And here the move, bishop takes g7, king takes. Again, white should play f5. White's been holding this move off. f5 is a very good move there. White does not play that. We have rook d1, a6, good move. b5, good move. Queen e3, rook c8, solid move. Put that rook on the semi-open file. That's a great spot for it. Bishop e2 is played. We have the move queen c7, getting that queen off of that file, which is a really nice idea. b4, kicking our knight back. But just because you're kicking our piece back, it doesn't mean it's good. When you do that, our knight comes back. Now your knight is weak. We got to think about activity, weaknesses. By playing b4, white got what exactly? A c5 square that's already very well defended by a pawn and 3 pieces. A square in a5 that nothing on white's side can take advantage of unless you swing this knight all the way over here. What white did get out of it is a knight on c3 that's very vulnerable to attack. We have a battery ram on that minor piece. And just a lot of activity there. Rook d3 is played. d5. David aggressively striking in the center here. Notice if a move like e5, always keep in mind when you move a piece, you are letting go of something, particularly with pawns. Pawns make up, the framework of chess. I know I'm talking a lot about pawns in this segment, but the Hippopotamus Defense, it's not an opening where we're trying to win in 5 moves. It's an opening that's focused on middle game, positional, attacking, theoretical, dynamic chess. That's a lot of words, but in this case, e5 weakens f5. Well, let's take it. Let's attack that queen. Let's play a move like knight b6. I really like this move, just going for c4. If you want to try to kick our knight out of f5, well, we're just going to jump right in. Attack your rook. If you move to f2, we could even play the move knight e4, forking your rook, queen, and we're attacking your knight. And if you take, well, we have another fork, a pawn fork with your rook and your knight. So white can crumble very quickly here in positions like this. Our pieces, again, they're unified. They have great prowess and great, ability to jump into certain spots. Our knights in particular. All of these squares that you see right here are all squares that, depending on the position in a single move, we can go to in one spot, right? White can't say the same thing with their knights that are on c3 and f3. I don't think those knights traditionally on c3 and f3 have as many options against something like the Hippo when we play it right. So, especially in a case like this, right? So e takes d5, we capture back with the knight. Bishop takes d5, great move. c3, bishop takes a2. Okay, the rook attacks our bishop. We bring our bishop back to c4. Rook d2 is played. We capture, and we now see David take on c3. Look, David's playing against an FM, and he's earned himself a position, in which case black is up a pawn. Black is winning this position. We see the move of rook fc8. David here, just doubling up those rooks. And sure, white is able to get a pawn, but then we play the move of knight d5. Attacking the pawn on f4. This is hard to defend. If you defend it, well, with the pawn, we win your knight. That's not great. If you defend it with the rook, check, knight c3. Your rooks are forked here. So the move of rook b7 is played. We see knight takes f4. Knight takes h3. Nice idea there. The whole idea being trying to distract that pawn so that we can win that knight on f3 or capture it. And then at that point, we're up 2 points. 2 pawns of material, but we have knight f2 now, jumping around. Rook takes e6, getting one of the pawns back. Knight g4, check. h5, advancing aggressively. Knight h6, might as well hold on to stuff and also threaten knight f5 with a forking idea. King f2, we have check. Rook b2, getting behind the pawn, great idea. Rook e2, check, and now rook cb1. Now, not a bad move, not a blunder, that is, but I do think that black had the right idea. David had the right idea here. Double up rooks, attack the b pawn like crazy, right? Attack that pawn like crazy, see what, white's going to do there. But the problem is when you do that, white trades off. And I know that we're up material, and I always talk about trading down if you're up material, but here in this case, if you double up the rooks without getting traded, you can actually win that b pawn, right? And that's a big difference. So going back, if let's say we play rook b3 first, you can't offer a trade here. I mean, you could offer a trade with our c rook, but then we step over. Now we got two rooks, not just the one going after b4. If you defend it with a rook, well, now you left your knight behind, right? So I think in this case, saving the rook, then doubling up is a great practical idea. But okay, we have that rook come here. We trade off. We're still better here. Rook d2, rook d5. And just some overall, really solid endgame chess from black. Advancing the pawns, keeping an eye on that b4 spot. King g5, continuing to advance. Rook b4, getting behind the pawn, attacking the pawn on g2, snatching it off. b6 is played. We have h3 and rook h8. Now here in the game, h2 is played. This is a mistake, surprisingly enough. And white here plays extraordinarily well, okay? It's like, I'm not accusing anyone of cheating here at all, 100%. I'm not. But these next two moves are like, they're very hard to find, especially with only having nearly 2 minutes on the clock. I mean, I'm very impressed by these moves that white found. Again, I'm not, accusing nobody of cheating. I just want to get that out there. White did not cheat. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying is white found a couple of moves here that most players aren't going to see. I don't know if I'd find these moves this quickly as white did, in this kind of game. So here's the thing. Here's the issue. After the move of h2, white finds the move of king b3. That's a great idea. Before we get into why that was a mistake, what should have black done here? Well, play rook b2. Go, you know what? Take my pawn. I'll take yours. I have two extra pawns there. That is winning for black. You just got to be patient. You just got to keep slowly making some progress, and you're going to end up finishing that thing out. If king c5, we'll push the pawn. And at the end of the day, you can push your king all you want. We're going to do the same thing. You can guide your pawn to a victory, but we're just going to take. And at the end of it, if the rook takes, we're going to have a queen and a king against your king and rook, and we're going to have a couple of pawns. If you take with the king, even easier for black. We're just going to push this pawn down and we're winning. So, I do think here that black really needs to quickly get behind that pawn and then just start making progress. Let white promote. That's fine. You can promote as well, and you have an extra couple of pawns on top of that. But here we have the move h2 and king b3. This prevents the rook from coming in. It prevents it, right? And we can't just, push the f pawn or something because white is going to promote there. We can't play rook up because we are going to lose our pawn. We can't play rook up and just lose our pawn and think that we're skewering because then the rook blocks on b2. So here we see a check. Good move from black. And now there's only one move for white that gets a draw. That's it. I know I'm kind of geeking out over the endgame here, but this is good stuff. White plays the move king a2. That's the only move here that draws. Nothing else does. If you play king c4, king b4, king a4, any of those lose. Let's cover why. Let's just cover one of them. Against all three, the idea is the same. We can put this king in check. Notice we need to get our rook here to cut the rook off, right? We can't just go over because we just lose our rook. So we go check. I don't care where your king was. We check, block with the rook. We're good. If you push the pawn, thanks for the rook, we defend. If you trade and then push, we have a queen versus queen. Still a long battle here, but black is winning. You got to keep your pieces together, and whenever you can, try to block with a pawn when you get checked. And just keep slowly making progress on the board. Eventually, black can win this thing. Going back, right? Let's say we see a move like king to c2. Well, rook g4 takes rook b4. Rook b4 can be played. And we're going to take. If the king went to b2, well, rook b4. Check. We take. So the idea there is that the king can't go to c2, where we're able to play rook b4, and then white kind of just loses the pawn. They can't put their king on b2 because then we check the king. King a2 is the idea there. And now if we saw the move of rook g4 takes, rook b2 can be played. We can't take that rook or we're going to lose, so we'd have to check, bring our rook back, and this is a draw, apparently. I feel like depending on how the game goes, either side could win. But there you go. In the game here, though, we have check, and they end up repeating. And then white here plays very well with king a2 and king b3. Overall, very well played from David there. I mean, at the very end, a small little slip, and the FM took great advantage of that with his endgame understanding. Just remember, when you see this move, f4, I recommend e6, knight e7. Keep an eye on f5. This is going to save you guys so much trouble. It's going to save you so many games where you just get blasted. I've got blasted in the hippo, and if you got blasted in the hippo, I encourage you, don't give up on it, right? Don't give up on it. Some openings just aren't for everyone. I understand that. I understand the hippo's not for everybody. I don't think back in the day, I don't know how I would have done, actually. I was about to say I wouldn't have done well. I'm not sure. I'm not totally sure when I was a kid how I would have done. But what I will say is that in the hippo, if you play the hippo, if you play the Pierce, if you play the modern, if you play the check Pierce, if you play the black lion, if you play all those Philidor, any of those openings where you're not striking in the center right away, where you're playing more prophylactically, where you're fighting, for the center later on, there's going to be games where you get blasted. That's just part of it. Learn from it. Learn how to play better defensive chess. In this case, keeping eyes on f5 is huge. And then going 1, 2, and 3. Again, f5's well covered. And if the knight ever wants to, try to help out, well, then we just take on d4. White's center starts to fall apart. And at moments there, you can play d5 to distract the e-pawn. And even if the e-pawn pushes, generally speaking, f5 is just way harder to pull off because white doesn't have that e-pawn supporting it. All right, for game number 7, we got my guy, Nick Luciano. We've done some private lessons over the years and talked a lot of chess. He's also a supporter on the Patreon page, and we have a Discord for Patreon members, in which case we just, chat, talk about chess, all that kind of stuff. And I mentioned how we're doing a 100th Hippo video covering subscriber games, and he decided to play a Hippo game. Now, he hasn't played a Hippo game, a rapid time control Hippo game, in 2 years. This is the first time he's done it in rapid in 2 years, and Nick pulls off nearly 94% accuracy in his first Hippo rapid game in years. I actually think this is a very instructional game for the black side, and it's very well played. So we see this move e4. We have 1, 2, and 3. Now again, I usually go 4, but Hikaru likes a6, so that there's nothing wrong with that. I've done this before too at times. So bishop d3, we have e6, knight e7, h6, b6. I like this move. You could play b5, but then it kind of gets white a little bit worried about castling queenside, and I love the hippo against white castling queenside. White here does it, and now we know when you're playing the hippo and you see your opponent castle queenside and they have pawns on d4 and e4, I don't care where these ones are at, e4 and d4, and these pawns are just kind of chilling, you got to attack. You got to attack that king, and that's exactly what we see in this game in a great fashion. Knight d7. Here, e5 is played. Now, d5 is played. This is really the only critique I have of this game, honestly. I think here bishop b7 is a little bit better. Just continuing to develop. We have a lot of pressure on that e5 spot, and if white takes, we'll take back with the c-pawn. What do we get out of it? A c-file directly against the enemy king. Now, white does get technically the same kind of thing, but I would say that the c-file is a lot more valuable in this kind of case, because our king can always get off of this e8 square, and the c-file can just really pay dividends. We're looking at advancing that pawn like crazy. d5 and f5 are weak, particularly d5, and we have 2 very active bishops here. I mean, this is just a great game. Knight f6 flexibility as well, because that pawn pushed and captured. So again, if you see the e-pawn push, locking it up isn't always the answer, but locking it up still gives black a very playable game here, and we have quick advancement with c5. Great move. Here, white should have played a move like c3. Just keeping everything together. You want to keep this pawn on d4. The moment you take, e5 gets weak. Don't do that if you're white. But here we have, potentially a move like queen c7, b5. A fun game for black. I like this position for black. So c5 is played, but white takes. Again, look to the sides. Is there a black pawn there? Yep. Okay, take with the pawn. Now we are wiping out half of the 4th rank. We are threatening, this move of c4, which traps the bishop. White fixes this, kind of, by playing knight f4. Sure, that's not a trap anymore for that bishop, but now d4 is played. The bishop on e3 is trapped. So this is completely winning. Rook b8, great move, activating on the b file. We have capturing off, bishop takes e5, queen b6, continuing to just activate those pieces, bring them towards the queen side of the board. Bishop b1, knight a4. I love this move. I've played knight a4 over the years. You know, eventually, obviously, you got to get your knight to c5 or b6 first, but that knight is a monster attacking key dark squares. b3 is played. Okay, back to c5. Now that's a big old weakness. c3 is weaker as well. f4, we see the bishop come right back. We see capturing on f5, and here, you know, white probably played it because they thought maybe queen d8 was mate. That's what they did, but after queen takes d8, white resigns. Again, besides not pushing to d5 and just leaving that pawn there for the moment, I don't really have much to say about that game. Nearly 94% accuracy from Nick. Just a masterpiece. For our 8th game, we got my guy Joshua again playing as black here, and we got 1, 2, and 3. Okay, white here going for a very aggressive setup. Black here plays very well, tucking the knights. b6, that's great. Bishop b7, good move. h6, that's great. f3 is played. Now here a6, I don't know if I'd play that in this position, simply based on the fact that there is a pawn on c4 and we can't play b5. And here, if we see a move like a4, we might want to play a5 and slow it down, and we just use 2 tempi, right? But all I have to say, after a6, this is still playable. Rook c1, we have f5 striking on the king side. Knight takes f5 now. Great move. Again, when you see a flank pawn push, when you push a flank pawn and they capture, look to the sides. Do you see a pawn? No? Okay, take with the knight. Take with the knight. You're attacking the bishop and the pawn. Bishop f2 is played, by far white's best move. And here the move of queen e7 is played. I think better there is taking on d4 because you got numbers there. Here black can win a pawn. Yeah, look, we're going up against a national master this game. Josh is going up against a national master. It's move 13. This isn't bullet. We're playing blitz. Move 13. We can already go up a pawn. We can take with the bishop and then the knight, or if you like your bishops, take with the knight first, right? But in the game here, we have queen e7 again. You can capture off with the knight, take with the bishop. Here, you could play queen e7. That's a good move. You could also play queen h4. And look, if white wants to kick your queen back, fine. We'll go back to e7. I mean, by playing g3, you've weakened your king a little bit. We now have bishop on b7 that only has one pawn in the way. And this is a great game for black. But again, we have the move queen e7. White's able to play knight to e4 and save that pawn, castling queenside now. Now this is a gutsy move here for black. In all honesty, you got 2 pawns here ready to barrel down a pawn on a4. I don't know if I'd recommend castling queenside there, but things do work out. d5 is played, and now the move of knight c5. Now, I do want to mention in this kind of position, I always talk about, right, if you see d5, if you see the d pawn push, lock it up. It doesn't apply here because we don't have regular pawn structure. In this case, right, white doesn't have a pawn on e4. We don't have a pawn on f7. Our bishop is already very active, guys. It's already great. It's already very active, and there's no pawn on e4. By playing e5, we're just making our bishop bad. That's all we're doing. That's all we're doing here. There's really no good point of playing e5. If anything, white can just start playing b4, c5. We're in big trouble. Better, really, a move that I would recommend here is a move like rook he8. Just get ready to gear up when this position opens up. If white takes, we'll take back with the queen. Knight d5, we don't got to be worried about that. The bishop unleashes. The bishops are the soul of the hippo. You can capture on b2, and if the rook moves, jump back to square like e5, and black's better here. But again, in the game here, we have the move of knight c5. Now, the reason this move is a mistake is simply due to the fact that white can play b4, and either our knight has to go back to d7, so we're kind of going in circles here, which we can't afford because we don't have time here. White has a lot of things they can do. If your opponent can't do anything in a position, you have all the time in the world to go back and forth. But if they do have a lot of stuff they can do, you got to act quick. And in this case, if we go back to d7, that's not great. It is the best move we have right now, because if we take on e4, f takes e4 is played, and then we got to play knight h4 if we're trying to save our knight, but then g3, we can try to save our knight again. But at the end of the day, guys, we're going to lose our knight. Of course, after knight c5, white misses this b4 move. We see the move knight takes c5. We usually take towards the center, but why not take with the d pawn? This allows our rook to pin the pawn to the queen. We have a rook, pawn, and bishop all coming after that pawn on d5. And we're also attacking a key defender of that centralized pawn. So g4 is played, knight d4. Beautiful move by Josh. Capture on e6, queen takes e6, queen e1. Talk about an active game here. If you're comparing piece activity, we got 2 rooks on d8 and e8, a queen on e6, a knight right in the center of the board, and 2 bishops on b7 and g7. It's hard to get a better position than this when you're coming out of the opening at move 19, going up against a national master playing as white. So bishop h4 is played. We have g5. The bishop runs back. Now here, I think knight takes e2 is the best option. I mean, there's a bunch of moves that are winning, so I don't know if best is the right word even, but It's simple, right? We got the numbers. We got 3 attackers. We had 1, 2, and 3. White only had 2 defenders. If you have one more attacker than they have defenders, you'll win it, right? Just keep trading down. Queen takes, rook takes. We're up a piece. We got a rook on the second rank. 2 active bishops. Yet again, a rook that can jump on d2 if we want it to. But instead, we see this move, bishop e5, still winning. Bishop takes, queen takes. Rook f2 is played. Queen f4, just continuing to slowly put more and more pressure on the white side. Queen f1 is played. How can we continue activating our pieces? How can we put more pressure on white? Rook e3. That's exactly what we see here. Rook e3, knight e4. We see capturing off. Queen takes e4 here. Great position for black. Bishop d1 is played. Knight runs back. Knight jumps into f4. We see a trade-off, and b3. Again, you know, this position is completely winning for black. Not perfectly played move by move from black, but when does that ever happen? Hardly ever. And this entire time, black didn't let white back into the game. And that's the biggest thing, right? When you're playing a game of chess, don't be worried. Oh gosh, I found a mate in 3 and there was a mate in 2. I was minus, 6 after this move, and I could have been minus 8 for black. Look, either case, you're winning, right? Obviously, we want to improve. We want to see how we could have done things slightly better. But if you're not letting your opponent back into the game, that's the baseline. If you're doing that, you're doing your job, right? Anything above that's kind of extra credit, in my opinion. King takes f2. We throw in a check. Rook takes a2, and this game, we take on g4. We see taking. Josh continuing to just move the rooks around, and we have a little bit of a scramble here. If you look at the clock, both players are a little bit low on the clock, but black here, superior position and great endgame play. The rook runs to not get captured, and here at this point, white cannot win. Maybe you could set up a checkmate. Maybe you could. I think you might be able to set up a checkmate from this point, so white could win. But they have a minor piece. They're sitting at insufficient material. Here the game finishes up. Great game by Josh. For our 9th game, we got another game by Walter Reed, and his first 6 moves are exactly what I personally would play. This is the move order that I really like. 1, 2, and 3. Playing e6, dropping a knight on e7. Sometimes I mix that up with the move of pawn to h6, but so far this is how I'd play it. b6 here, knight f3. Now in this position, I would say maybe a move like c5 is a good way to just take some space. I mean, white's giving us that space, and in the game we see Walter do this very shortly, which is great. A move like d5 is what the engine is looking at. I personally probably wouldn't play d5 here. It's just not my approach to the hippo in these kind of positions, but d5 is obviously a very solid move for black. But here in the game, we have castle and kingside. I would say that this is a little bit risky, a little bit of a mistake, because white could have, they didn't do it, but white could have played h4. And if we castle too quickly in the hippo, it can make our king very prone to attack. In this particular instance, white hasn't castled, so they have the rook on h1 still. And, sure, we can slow down that pawn by playing h5, engine move, but then we could face something like g4. And if we end up taking knight g5, this feels losing for black. According to the engine, we're okay. It's 0.2, 0.3 for white, but practically speaking, it's going to be very difficult for black to hang on to this game. This actually reminds me of a game I played against Nigel Short, in which case he played a very similar idea against me. So all that to say, going back to knight f3, I personally wouldn't castle at this point in the game. I would just keep going into my hippo setup, finish out the fianchetto, drop a pawn on a6, tuck a knight on d7, just see what white is going to do. If they want to castle queenside, let's start attacking like crazy. If they castle kingside, all right, I'll castle kingside too. I'm not so worried about it. But at this point in the game, I wouldn't castle. But white here, they don't take opportunity to push that h-pawn, and we see castling kingside. So we're back to a solid game where we're not too worried about white's attacking chances. c5 here, love that move from Walter. If you're going to give us easy access, easy space, we'll take it. Bishop a2 was played in the game. Now here, h6 is played. I personally, even though h6 is actually a pretty decent move, I would personally play the move of knight bc6, right? I would throw this knight in looking towards d4. If a move like rook e1 or something, we could just throw a knight in there. If you want to take, our bishop will capture back, not the pawn, because we don't want to mess up our pawn structure. But if you want to keep attacking it, let's just give him more support. Take all you want. At the end of it, we're going to finish out with a check, and when the king moves, we could play a move like a6 supporting b5. We could bring this bishop back. We could play a move like bishop d7 supporting that b-pawn push. I personally really like rook b8, just looking towards b5 and b4. And we're black here with a very nice middle game position, very pleasant position to work with. But going back to bishop a2, we have this move of h6. Now, the engine doesn't hate this move, right? It's not the best move. It doesn't hate it. But what I would say is that generally speaking, when there is a pawn on f4, we don't necessarily want to put a pawn on h6 unless we're trying to play f5. That's really the only purpose of it. All that to say, Walter plays the move of f5 very shortly in this game, which is a common kind of way to slow down attacking chances whenever you see an f4 opening. If you're playing against the Vienna game, if you're playing against the Grand Prix attack, if you're playing against, let me think, what else is there out there? Austrian, right? Different kind of setups. Sometimes playing f5 just puts a hard stop to white's attack. And that's what we see Walter, try to do here. King h7, and now this move of f5. And black here still has a playable game here. Now, e5 is played. Good move from white, advancing in the center of the board. And now we have this move of d5. I personally, would say that d5, again, not a blunder or anything, but at the end of the day, is white going to take on d6? Does that benefit white or black? I think it benefits black, because if they do that, we can capture back with the queen. The bishop's more active. Sure, they do have an e5 square, but we could put a lot of defense on that. And at the end of the day, if you do throw a knight in there or something and we take it right off, you're going to end up with a pawn on e5 as white, most likely. So, all that to say, I do think that leaving it there is solid. You could also take on e5. That's a move here that we could think about. If the knight decides to capture back, let's just start developing and putting pressure on it, right? Just keep putting pressure on this knight. If you decide to defend it, we can capture off. Now you have a pawn on e5, which in one sense is annoying for us to deal with. In another sense, it's annoying for white because this pawn feels isolated simply due to the fact that this pawn cannot push because we have a pawn on c5. Maybe we play something like g5. We're looking towards f4 maybe. We're looking towards queen d4, putting pressure on that guy. Knight g6 is really something we're looking at. I think f4 at some point could be good, but we're not going to rush that too early because of those light scored weaknesses that can form. But yeah, all that to say, I think taking or leaving the pawn on d6 is something to think about, but d5 is played and the eval barely changes because of it. So, it's not like this is a horrible error or anything like that. Queen h3 is played, and now we have the move of king g8 stepping out of the way. g4, here we have the move of bishop to b7. And if you're playing white here, you don't want to lock up the king side, right? Common sense. If you're looking at the king side of the board and you're playing as white, you want this side of the board to open up like crazy. And if you're white, you want this side of the board to stay closed, to stay boring. And for black, it's the opposite, right? We want the king side to, in this kind of position, to close up because our king is in greater danger than white. I don't think it's necessarily because the placements of the kings. In fact, they're both on the king side on g8 and g1. But I would say that white's pieces are better placed for attacking chess. So we're a little bit more worried about them attacking us than they're worried about us attacking them. And here white plays the move of g5. This just gets rid of white's attacking chances out of the window. What should white do? Well, sure, you shouldn't take on f5. We have a lot of support there. But maybe play a move like rook f2. Maybe play a move like rook g2. Keep the tension. Keep putting pressure on the black side. See what happens. See what forms. See if black will ever make a mistake, like taking on g4 and opening up, that file for your rook and your queen. But in the game, we have g5 and Walter here, right? Does Walter want to take and allow the knight in, allow queen h7 ideas, or does Walter want to lock it up? Walter wants to lock it up, and Walter is absolutely correct. White's attacking chances are dwindling. In fact, they're probably dwindled at this point. Cannot move. Can move technically, but again, push all you want, you're going to get stuck. So now we start to see a shift in this game towards the queen side of the board a little bit. Knight b5 is played. Here, the engine really likes the move of bishop c6. Whole idea being if knight d6, there's no tempo on the bishop. There's no tempo there. In fact, we just, we can develop the queen to d7. I personally actually really like the move of knight c8. Just going, I don't like the knight there. I'm gonna attack it. I'm gonna offer a trade. And if white takes, I capture back with the queen and we're good. We have a playable game. But in the game here, we have knight bc6. White throws the knight in, and now rook b8. Okay, rook b8. There's different things that white can go with. I think that c4 is a move here that is very playable. Maybe b4. Just try to find ways to break open this position on the queen side now that it's shifted a little bit because this knight on d6 is very strong. I know just a second ago I was saying white doesn't want to open up the queen side. Well, that was before the king side got closed and before there was a knight on d6. This knight is very active. But white here plays the move of bishop to b1. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know what the purpose of that is. I don't know. I'm just going to leave it there. But knight c8 is played, right? Solid move, offering a trade. White goes, you know what? I'm just going to run out of there. But that allows Walter to play a6. And all of a sudden, we have a very solid position as black. Knight 8 to e7, kind of starting to unravel the position a little bit. We're feeling a little bit less cramped. We're feeling like we have pawn breaks on the way, potentially. And yeah, knight e2 is played, d4. I actually really like this move from Walter. This gives this bishop great activity. And let's just compare for a second this bishop on b7 and the bishop on b1. Which is better? The bishop on b7 by far. Now, white could fix this. In the game here, white could play bishop a2. I mean, look at the activity of this bishop right now. Horrible. One of the worst bishops I've seen in a long time. Maybe the worst. I might go that far. How could this bishop get any worse if there was a pawn on a2? And you can't even have that in the game of chess. A bishop on b1 and pawns on c2 and a2 unless you're setting up the board wrong. Like what happens a lot when I, visit some elementary schools and they got the knights and the bishops messed up at the start of the game. But yeah, fix your bishop. Fix your bishop. Bishop a2. Go after that pawn. It's a good start for white. I'll say that. But in the game, we have the move of pawn to c3 and queen d5. Another active move here from black. And, if white wants to play c4, then queen d7. If a4 trying to slow us down from playing b5, we don't care. We're playing it anyways. Take all you want. We're able to jump into b4. You don't have the ability to guard this pawn well. And, yeah, it's just a hard position for white to play. So all that to say, going back to queen d5, we see c takes d4. This allows knight takes d4. Great move from Walter. Knight captures back, c takes, bishop d2, and now the move of queen b5, targeting that pawn on b2. White goes, you know what, I'm going to block it, but we now have the move of rook f2 e8. The engine's saying to play, something like knight d5, as well as rook fe8. Rook fe8 is a good move, queen d7. There's different options there. I would say that personally, I wouldn't play knight d5. I think it's a little bit too risky there, practically speaking. But, rook fe8 is played. White ends up taking on e7 and going with bishop c2. Right? This bishop's still not very active, still not very strong. This allows Walter to just pick off the pawn on b2. Rook fc1 is played. We bring the rook over, and you can't move your bishop anywhere without dropping your rook on c1. We have the numbers there. We have the numbers. So this bishop moves. We got 2 attackers on c1, only 1 defender. So we're going to win that. So we see queen g2, also defending this bishop that was threatened. And there's a couple ways to, win material here, a couple really good moves. One of them is just taking off the knight. And then, once the queen takes, all right, the queen got distracted. We take on c2 and we're up a piece and a pawn. I mean, pretty good. The other way that, we could play this really well is rook ec7. This is what Walter plays. And this is a good way of keeping the tension. Again, if the bishop moves, thank you for the rook. Thank you for the rook. And how could you defend the bishop again? Well, you could play knight e1 and defend the bishop. You're holding on. But then you lose your queen. So white here is just dead lost. There's no way around that. Queen f2 is played. We see the move of bishop takes f3 now. Rook takes c2. Rook a b1. And we got the numbers there. Let's take on c1. We capture again. Rook takes c1 is a little bit faster, but at the end of this, black stays in the driver's seat the entire game. And we see this game, finish up pretty quickly. Nice game by Walter there. And I'll just say again, like when it comes to piece activity, this move of bishop to a2, this bishop's really active. When you're talking about activity with the bishops don't care if they're on a square like a2 or b1, as long as there's a nice long diagonal that they can work with. And again, we're not so worried about a knight being in the way and the bishop. We're worried about pawns being in the way. And when you go to b1, you don't got 1 pawn, but you have 2 pawns in the way. This bishop is horrendous, and Walter took advantage and really broke through in the center and played some good positional chess, put the pressure on white, and ended up with the W. Next up, we got my guy Billy, the bird's opening expert, and in this game, he's playing as black. We got e3, 1, 2, and 3, e6, b6. This is all very standard for black, this kind of stuff. Bishop e7, knight e7, bishop d2 is played, and in the game here we have pawn to c5. You could argue that maybe castling kingside is slightly better, and it's it gives us just a little more time to read out what white's doing. But this move of c5 is very sound. It's putting pressure on d4, and white's just not going to get a lot out of using their d-pawn to capture on c5. Now, what does this allow white to do? It allows the move of knight b5. And when you see this, right, when you play c5 without the pawn on a6, which of course a6 just prevents knight b5 altogether, but when you play c5 and you do see that knight jump in, there's a few different ideas in terms of, okay, how do we defend the pawn on d6? In this kind of position, if a knight, after you play f5 jumps into g5, you could be in big trouble. But the nice thing about a pawn being on d6 is that all you got to do is move this knight and boom, you're defending the pawn, right? So that's one idea to start. In this position in particular, knight f6, white could take, and if we take with the b pawn, there's a bunch of moves here for white that give them a nice position, but bishop a5 is completely winning. So knight f6 here isn't the best idea, particularly in this line, because if we take the bishop, knight takes d6 with check, we lose the bishop here, our king's on f8, a knight on d6, that's a monster. This is not great. And if we take with the d-pawn, much better move, but even something like bishop c3, our rook's going to come to d1 very quickly. d6 is a big weakness. This knight's still very active, and we're in trouble. We're in trouble to say the least. So going back, sometimes knight f6 in general is a good idea to defend d6, but in this kind of position, white, could take. They could put a rook on d1, a bishop on c3. That's not great for us. The best move, according to the engine, is actually knight f5, right, defending that pawn. And in this kind of position, right, it's a little bit different. It's a little bit different here because if white ends up taking on c5, our knight can capture back with tempo against the queen. You can't kick our knight with e4. If you kick it with g4, all right, we kick your knight as well. Whole idea being, you take my knight, I'm going to take yours. If you want to keep taking pawns all day, that's fine. White is up a pawn, but we play here a move like queen f6. We got great pressure against that knight on f3, and white doesn't have a pawn on g2. According to the engine, this is winning for black. So going back to knight b5, knight f5 is a good option. Another good option here is queen to b8 here. And that's what we see Billy go with, simply defending that pawn on d6. Bishop c3 is played. And now we have the move of a6. The engine move here is c takes d4. Whole idea being if the knight wants to capture back, we'll play e5 and all that kind of stuff. But a6 here, very sound move. Knight a3, castling kingside, knight c2, queen c7, starting to unravel a little bit. This move of rook to b8, and this is what can happen against the hippo, right? White will try to take advantage of a pawn on d6, but then they're kind of forced back into this weird, awkward position that they probably never played before. I'm assuming most players as white don't aspire for this setup. But when you play the hippo, stuff can just get weird, especially when you don't know what the heck your opponent's doing. They might think you're playing weird, but you're playing how you always play, and to you it's normal. So rook fd1 here, we have the move of h6. d5 is played, and here here there's a couple of ideas. e5 is played in the game, and all that to say, turns out that here taking the pawn is actually a good idea. Now again, usually the d-pawn pushes, all right, the d-pawn pushes, block it up. That's the whole idea. But there are exceptions, and according to the engine, this is one of them. If we do take, let's say white captures back, we can take on c3. If the queen wants to take back, all right, we take on d5, we're up a pawn. If the pawn captures back, we got b5 advancing here. And the whole idea now is like, look, if you want to play e4 to defend your pawn more before we play c4, and we're still going to play c4, we're going to play a move like knight c5, we're going to break with f5 here. White's position is terrible. Look at their pieces. Imagine playing this from the white side. What are you doing? Gosh. And if you take on f5, knight takes d5 is played. If you take on g6, black just throws a knight in there. This is disastrous for white. You can just resign at this point. So d5 is played, and e5 is a response here. Now, all that to say, black's still better here. In my opinion, practically speaking. And the engine is having a hard time figuring out exactly where it is. It's just about dead even according to the eval, but this is a very hard position for white to play. Look at that queen on b3, the knight on c2. Black, on the other hand, with very easy ideas to expand quickly if we want to. Bishop d2 is played, and the engine move here is pawn to e4, but instead we see this move knight f6, still a solid idea. a3 is played, b5 starting to break things open, trying to distract this pawn, and when white does take, bishop takes d5. Great move here from Billy, just attacking that queen like crazy, asking white what you want to do. If a move like queen a4 we can take, you want to capture back with the bishop, we just keep attacking your queen. The queen's just running all over the place trying to survive. This is not great for white. If we see a move like queen c3, we just take and we're up a pawn here, on top of having better activity and greater gameplay. And in the game here, we have queen d3, pawn e4 is played, and white resigns because we simply have a fork, right? Queen d3 wasn't a great move there because pawn e4 can be played, and we have a fork. But overall, yeah, good game played by Billy. Just a good example of playing hyper-dynamic chess. You see a pawn in that kind of position on d5. Right, e5 is played again, not the engine move, but it's still very playable. If I was playing in a tournament, I would love this position for black. I would push the pawn to e5, and if bishop d2, there's a lot of different things that we can do here. But even playing knight f6 and then really breaking things open with b5 there, that's a great idea. This pawn is a key defender for d5. We're looking to take on c4, weakening this pawn even more. And if you take, all right, the bishop falls in, we're sitting at even material, b5 is in trouble, and white's in trouble at the end of the day. Next up at number 11, we got my guy Keith, another Patreon supporter who is a math teacher in Australia. Great guy. And here he's playing with the white pieces. Now we see this move of g3, bishop g2, and now the move of e3, right? I would usually play d3 there, but e3, totally fine here. Queen f6 is played. I mean, once you see the pawn on e3, there's really no point of playing queen f6. You're not threatening anything. I mean, take our pawn all you want. Go ahead. We're going to be up a queen for a pawn. Of course, black doesn't do that. We see the move of d6, a3, and now the move of b4 again. If you want to try to get tempo against a bishop on c5 if you're white, or a tempo if you're black against a bishop on c4, do it, right? Push that pawn, get some tempo, get some space. In this kind of game here, you know, there's different things that black can try, but they don't work. Like, for example, e4. We're not going to take this bishop. We're not doing that and losing our rook. We could play a move like rook a2 if you really want to get crazy, and then when the bishop runs away, you can play bishop b2. I would personally probably just play a move like d4, attack the bishop again, and now we're just up a pawn. We're up a pawn here. I mean, we're great. But following b4, we see the move of knight g4. Now this is a threat. Again, guys, when you see the queen come out, don't worry so much about the queen being out. The queen often can't do much. The queen can make cheap little threats. That's about it. Of course, there's exceptions to that, like the Scandinavian defense is a famous opening where black can actually bring out the queen and it's playable. But most openings, the queen doesn't come out super early and make threats and do all this crazy stuff. Even in the Scandinavian defense, the queen often doesn't make threats. It just goes to the square of a5, which is very comfortable. But in this case, we are, you know, looking at a pawn on f2 that is attacked twice and only defended once by our king. All right, queen e2. Good move here from Keith. Bishop b6 is played, h3, kicking that knight back, bishop b2, knight c6. I think this is a good opportunity to play a move like c4. If black's going to give you that space, take it. Very next turn, you can play a move like knight c3. You can jump into e4, or, you know, e4, d5, and you have a great game there. Here we see the move knight d2, though, and this is playable as well, right? When you're playing the Hippopotamus Defense, everyone has their own personal style. I love to take space if they're going to give it to me, but knight d2, very playable. Bishop e6 is played, and now we see the move b5. Now, I do think that this isn't the best move. Not terrible or anything. White's still better. But this does allow the knight to come to a5. Now, we know that the knight on the rim is dim, but with a knight on a5 like this knight is plugging up pawns. This pawn is overextended, and this knight at some point is going to start looking at certain squares. I know right now they're all defended, but this knight on a5 is actually not all that bad. But black needs to play here, you know, a move like knight a5 or a move like knight d8, because the move of a knight b8 is played. And we see bishop takes b7. The rook's done. And this happens so much in the Hippo. Your opponents just will literally forget that your bishops are there, especially when you got two of them. And in this case, we just see Keith with a one game, absolutely winning. I mean, castling kingside, we take the rook. We see the move bishop g2. I love what Keith did there. Take your rook, get the heck out. No shame in that. d5 is played, f4. This pawn is pinned. Queen g6, g4, continuing to advance, capturing back. Knight c5. All right, let's fork the queen and the bishop. And this game just continues to unravel with white winning more and more material. Black may have thought this was mate, but we simply play knight b1, and this game wraps up. So very sound, solid game from Keith there. And just remember, right, when you do see a queen come out that early, you got to assess threats. In this case, the pawn's on e3. It's not a threat. If your pawn was on d3 and you see that move, all right, stop the threat. Stop the threat. Boom, right, in general. And more generally speaking, like if we're playing as black and we see this queen come out to h5, all right. Of course, here we're not playing the Hippo, right? This is more just a general tip, but 3 things are attacked, only 1 is threatened. We don't care if you take either of these. Go ahead. So, all right, let's defend that pawn. Let's see you go here. All right, again, this queen is attacking 3 different things. Count how many pawns the queen's attacking, then look at what it's threatening. The pawn on f7 is the only thing the queen's threatening. All right, let's stop it. Threaten again. Okay, let's block. Threaten again. I mean, there's a lot of things that we can do here, including, queen e7, which is, a quiet move. Knight d4 is actually the engine move there, because if the bishop takes, we play king up, and the queen, you can try to hang on to the bishop, but we're just going to keep kicking your queen around. This queen cannot hold on to the bishop on f7 forever. Anyways, back to the hippo, but in general, the queen coming out super early, especially against something like the hippo, is just not going to work. Next up, we got another game from my guy Ronald playing as black against d4. We have 1, 2, and 3. Knight e2 is played, e6, knight d7. This is all very sound. Knight e7. I don't know what white's doing there. That's kind of a weird setup. I mean, these pawns here can actually be, a pretty solid fortress, right? White going, you know what? You're going to build a fortress. You're going to build a wall. Let me do the same thing. But bringing this knight to g3, you're just bringing it to a spot where it's neutralized. That's why I think the cow opening, for example, if any of you have looked at Anna Kramling's cow opening, I don't think it does very well against the hippo, because if you bring a knight to g3, it's just neutralized by our pawn on g6. I mean, where's that knight going? I don't know. But okay, we have the move a6 against bishop c4, b5, kicking that bishop around. Bishop b3 is played, knight b6. Nice little knight tuck there. Knight d2, bishop b7 is played, and castling kingside h6, just continuing to get into our hippo kind of structure. And bishop e3. What do we do now? Right, we got our kind of setup. We got this knight tucked on b6. The move of d5 is played, and I actually think that this is a little bit of an error. I think better here might be a move like a5, because a move like a5, you're not committing to anything crazy. Again, you can push the a and h pawns without having to commit to much, because they're only weakening 1 square instead of 2. I mean, of course, I'm throwing up. Anyways, there's the math for you, right? 1 instead of 2. But yeah, I mean, if white wants to play a move like a4, we can take. If the bishop captures back, we take again. This is isolated, but we're not too worried about it. We can keep pushing that pawn down the board. We have a b8 square that we can work with. We can castle very quickly. Either bringing the queen to b8 or even queen d7 and bringing the other rook over. Kind of reminds me of a Banco a little bit, but just really going down on those b and a files can be really good for us. But here in the game, we have the move of d5. And the reason I think this is a little bit of a mistake is that after e5, it's going to be hard for us to keep expanding in a position like this, because we don't have any pawns that can support a c5 push, right? Generally speaking, though, this kind of pawn structure is something that we want to get, but we want to make sure that we've already played c5 or that we can pull that move off. But all that to say, still a playable game for black. We have queen d7, queen c2, and now the move of knight to c4. I love this idea in the hippo. I love that Ronald's using it, throwing that knight in. You got so much support towards that spot. And, in the game here, we have the move of knight takes c4. Big mistake. But let's just say the bishop captures back. What do we do here? Well, in the Hippopotamus Defense, we usually, in this kind of structure, if you have this kind of pyramid structure going to c4 or f4, either one, and you want to have unity among your pawns either way, we usually take away from the center to activate this bishop, right? To activate that bishop. Of course, in this case, the pawn on c4 is a little bit loose, and white can pretty easily just play a move like b3 and start chipping away at it. We as black are going to start looking at moves like, knight d5 or bishop d5 or knight f5, just trying to jump into some of those spots. White, on the other hand, is going to start looking at knight e4 or one of those knights jumping in, c5, all that kind of stuff. So I would give white the edge here. But instead, white plays a move knight takes c4. Against that, we take with the d pawn again. And that bishop's done. The bishop's done. I mean, the bishop tries to get something for itself, but we're up a piece for a pawn now. f4 is played. Maybe white's trying to play aggressive attacking chess, but in this kind of position, you've already committed to e5. f5 is simply not doable here. Ronald has a clamp down, a pawn clamp on that square, a knight as well, a queen as well. What does white have? No pawns. Well, that kind of ends that discussion. Here we see the move of queen c6. By playing that pawn up, you also gave us the opportunity to activate even more along that diagonal. And I love the finish here. I love the ending that Ronald showed off here. And that's really the importance in positions like this, when white has extended with moves like f4, e5, d4, the importance of pushing your h-pawn. The last 4 moves of the game here, all h-pawn moves. 1, 2, 3, 4. White resigns. Great game. Great game for black. Just fantastic. So going back, what I will say, right? Let's take a look at this. So h5. You can play h4, but if you do that, then that pawn's a little bit of a weakness because no pawn defends it, whereas we do have a pawn defending our h-pawn. King f2, we kick the knight. h3. What can white do here? Well, if the rook takes, we take on g2, and we're going to win the rook. If, let's say, the pawn takes, all right, we're going to win the rook again. So taking either way, you lose your rook. What if the g-pawn pushes to g3? All right, we take the rook. What if the pawn pushes to g4? Okay, we take the rook, right? So white here feels a little bit frozen. White ends up playing the move of rook to g1, but after we take on g2, this rook is hanging right now. We have a queen and a bishop looking towards it, a rook coming down on h2. We're up 3 points in material, a knight that can very easily get involved in the action here. Not jump into f4, but jump into f5, right? Or maybe d5. It just depends what your preference is there, but I would probably look towards f5 and just a winning position for black, right? But overall, great game by Ronald there, right? I do think that we need to be a little careful in terms of locking up the center if we don't have the ability to play c5. But all that to say, from that point, still a playable game in that position. And the Hippopotamus Defense, right? It's very easy to get caught up in the eval in general. Oh gosh, I was 0.2, now I'm 0.7, all this kind of stuff. But if you have a position that you like, even if the engine says it's not the best, and I'm talking about even throughout all this video, when I'm saying certain moves aren't the best move, sometimes I'm picking a move that is like 0.1 under the engine, what it says. And it's like, who cares at that point, right? Or sometimes I'm saying, yeah, this is the best move, quote unquote, but what this person played is totally fine, especially in a practical setting. I cannot tell you how many times I've went into a middle game down about -1 if I'm white, or down +1 if I'm black, and ended up winning the game because I felt comfortable and good in the positions that I was reaching. For our 13th game, we got my guy Harvey Brandt, who actually won with the Hippo here in 16 moves. Pretty rare you hear about that, but against the move d4, we got 1, 2, and 3. a6, great move. e6, this is perfect. Knight d7, all this kind of stuff, great. White has castled queenside. We need to attack that king on the queenside, but there's a process to it, right? We're not just going to play b5, b4, a5, a4, a3. No, we got to get our pieces involved, and developing in a Hippo type fashion puts our pieces in a great spot to attack on the queenside, right? Kind of a callback to that Nick Luciano game. The Hippo defense, when you see castling queenside in this kind of pawn structure from white, gives us great chances to attack like crazy and get a lot of fun wins from the black side. Now, knight f3 is played. Now we see b5. Why not advance that pawn? That's a great move. Knight e2, bishop b7. Love this. Putting pressure on e4. e5 is played. Now, the engine here throws out different moves, including d takes e5. But in the game, we have knight b6, and I love this move. This is a great option. This knight looking towards light squares like c4, a4, d5. I love this. E takes d6 is played. And here we could take with the pawn, but we instead see the move of knight to c4. Gaining tempo against that queen. Hard to argue with that one. Now, if a move like queen d3, if the queen decides to move, all right, we'll take with the c pawn. Not with the queen, but with the c pawn, because this c file is going to be fantastic for our rook to come over to and just, really stake out an active spot in this attacking game. But instead in the game, we have d takes on c7. Now, in this case, if we capture on d2, we lose our queen as well. We don't want that. So we see the move of queen takes c7 from Harvey, and queen b4, and now the move of knight e7 and knight d5. Notice just how quickly that knight got over and active into this game. And white needs to be careful here. Now let's say white played a move like queen b3. We can castle. That's fine. If you capture on c4, we take with the pawn. If you play h4, let's just say white starts to attack. They're way far behind. And I've seen this again and again, right? There's a tournament chess game that comes to mind where I was so far in the attack as black with the Hippo, surprisingly enough. And, even against white trying to play crazy attacking chess on the king side, in this kind of position, white's just way too late. We could play a move like rook fc8, bishop d2. Let's start pushing. You want to keep, okay, fine. We'll keep pushing. We got tempo on your queen. If you decide to take the pawn, we could play bishop a6. Let's say you want to save your queen and you want to go to a square like c5, for example, right? There's a lot of different things that we could see, but this is crushing no matter what white does. In this case, queen b7, the queen's done. The queen's done. So knight d5, a lot of different things that we can see. White ends up playing queen c5, which in one sense makes logical sense. Like, look, I'm being attacked. I'm up material. Let me trade down. The problem is once we capture, the soul of the Hippo, the bishop just came alive. Bishop takes b2 check. We throw a knight in. This game's over. Next up, we got a subscriber from South Korea with the username Czech Hippo. Love that, right? I love the Czech Pierts. Made a course on that. Love the Hippo defense. Czech Hippo. Respect the username. Now, here as black, we see our guy against e4 go with the move of d6. I love that this starts out with the Pierts. right? This is a valid way to start out the hippo. Very valid way to start. Playing the Pierce, right? There's a game in my over 6-hour course on the hippo where someone starts out with e6 with the French, and then they reach a hippo and they end up winning the game. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. This is a fun move order: d6, g6, and yeah, we end up with a6 here. Bishop c4, e6, bishop g5. Let's block that, right? We're not going to block with the pawn. We're not going to block with the bishop. We're not going to run to d7 with our queen. Just do what we're going to do anyways. Put the knight there, right? You attacked our queen. White might think they're changing our game plan. We're just doing what we were going to do anyways. Queen d2. Hey, we don't want to let this bishop into h6. Let's play h6 ourselves. Now we got a rook and a bishop guarding that spot. Bishop e3 is played. Knight d7. Again, we have castling queenside from white. We need to put pressure on the queenside now. b5 is played. Great move. And in this case, knight b6. Now, this is, in general, a good move to play. b5, tuck the knight. But I would say particularly when you're looking to gain space on the queen side in an attacking fashion against the opponent's king, I've learned that knight b6 can kind of slow our attack down a little bit because it's harder to pull the move of c5 off. And, white here needs to play well. They need to, play this move of d5 as one way to really kind of slow down our attack. And notice our knight on b6 is attacked, and again, d5, usually we lock it up, and that's the engine move here, is locking it up. But now our bishop's not an active piece in this game, and yeah, it just feels like our attacking chances are kind of diminished. Our c-pawn can't push anymore because this pawn is backwards, and white would take and have great activity with this bishop and on our d6 pawn. So our attack's kind of out the window in that kind of line, right? So what do I recommend here? Well, there's different ways of doing it. I like this move of bishop to b7. Bishop to b7. Now, if you see the move of d5, you don't have to play e5. You don't have to do that. You can play knight c5, going after that bishop. If white wants to take, you can capture back. If white wants to take again, you capture on d2, and you finish out with a move like c4, and you're close to winning this position as black. And let's say white plays a move like a3. This is an important part. We don't want to play knight b6 before c5. This knight on d7 is very critical in helping us push that c-pawn up 2 spots. All right, play the move of c5, and we have c4 ideas, we have b4 ideas potentially, but we want in this kind of attack, we don't want to push too hard, too fast. It needs to be in a very methodical kind of fashion, and memorizing this kind of idea, keeping this knight here, playing b5, and then c5 is very important. If white takes, we can take back with the pawn, right? Look to the sides. Is there a black pawn? Yep, okay, take with the pawn. And it's also very important that we did throw in that bishop b7 move at the start, because if we didn't, white could take on c5 and we couldn't capture back without our queen getting captured. But because we played bishop b7, our rook can capture back, we're winning here. So again, in a position like this, play bishop b7. You've already played b5, that's great. Play bishop b7, then c5, and then from there you can play queen c7, rook c8. At a certain point, your knight's going to be able to jump off and you're in business. But here, knight b6, again, white should play a move here like d5, but instead we see the move of h4. Queen d7 is played, a5 is the engine move here, and it makes sense, right? It's a great move, just expanding like crazy on the queen side. If a3, b4, breaking things open. If the knight takes a4, that bishop is donezo. But after h4, we have queen d7, e5, d5. I actually really like this move in this case. Now, I know in a previous game we were talking about how it's hard to pull off a c5 push, but in this kind of position, the king is not on g1, the king is on c1, and knight c4 is extremely dangerous because of that. g4 is played, b4. I love this move, kicking that knight around. The knight cannot go to a4, plugging things up, because we got a knight and a queen eyed towards that spot. Knight e2 is played, a5, great move, a3. Now in this case, a4 is played. Still better for black, but the best move is knight to c4. Nasty idea. If the queen wants to run to e1, we take the pawn. If the queen wants to go to d3, bishop a6 is a great idea. And if you take, we take with the d-pawn. If you want to take again, there's a lot of different things we can do, including queen a4, threatening a mate in 1. If the king runs over, we just take, and I mean, we're threatening a mate in 1 again. And if queen e1, we still take, and I mean, just talk about weaknesses for white, talk about activity for black. This bishop on b7 is going to become a monster. Now, this bishop on g7, is that a great piece? No. So let's move it back to f8 at some point, right? But we got bishop b7, we got knight d5. We have 2 pawns wiping out half of the 3rd rank on white's side of the board. This is resignable for white. And maybe they won't resign, but we're getting there. So a3, I mean, yeah, a4 there is what was played, but knight c4 this is just a great time to throw that knight into that spot. But a4, still a really good move. The bishop drops back. We see capturing on a3. And now the move of bishop a6. I like this idea. Bishop f8 is also a really good move as well. Again, once you get that bishop locked out, it's not stuck there forever. White spent all this time pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing and pushing, locking down your bishop. Okay, moving back. All of a sudden, your bishop's going after that very weak a3 pawn. That's great. Okay, and again, don't be worried about, oh, the bishop can't c far right now. It's a knight. We're not worried about it. If this was a pawn, yeah, bishop f8 would be bad, but it's a knight, so we're not worried about it. Going back, bishop a6, still a great improving move. I love that black didn't just put a bishop there. It's easy sometimes, right, to just get in the fashion of, oh, okay, I put bishop on b7, bishop on g. Whoa. Let's look at the position here. This bishop on b7 is not even close in activity compared to the bishop on a6. And that's exactly what we see here from the Czech Hippo player. h5, g5, white ends up sacrificing. Bishop c4, just continuing to add more pressure on the queen side. h6, really all this does is force our bishop to a better attacking spot. Bishop f8, bishop f6 is played. Black goes, you know what, take my rook, I don't care. If black did do that, I mean, we have a check, another check, taking, capture. I mean, this king's just done. I mean, look at this position. Instead of that, knight f4 is played. We could have seen the move bishop takes a3. Instead of that, we see bishop takes a2 first. Completely winning here, +4 in terms of material for black. White ends up taking on g6, and we don't see taking the knight. Bishop takes a3, game over. Remember, when you're trying to make space on the queen side, you're trying to attack, don't play knight b6 too early. Play b5, bishop b7, or bishop b7, b5, doesn't matter. And then from that point, you want to play c5 before knight b6, and you only want to play knight b6 once the pawn on c5 is well protected by a queen or a rook, all that kind of good stuff, right? So that you're well under control. Sometimes queen c7 is a good way to get off of that d file, but that's very important to not play knight b6 too early, because then, of course, I'm using my hands like I'm moving the piece and I'm talking on a screen board, but you get the point. If you move the knight too early, the c5 push is going to be a lot harder to pull off, if not impossible. That knight on d7 is critical. Let's keep it racing with my guy, Roger. Yes, Roger is a race car driver, Patreon supporter, and I'll say that I have never raced cars before, but pretty legendary stuff. Here, playing as black, Roger sees the move of f4 with the birds opening. Pretty rare you see that, right? But okay, we got g6, bishop g7, d6. Play the birds opening all you want. We're still playing the hippo here. d4. And this, all of a sudden, we've actually transposed into a 3-pawns attack. We see the pawns on f4, e4, and d4. This is where we need to do our whole e6, knight e7 thing, where we have our bishop, pawn, and knight aimed towards that f5 spot, or we can fall into trouble very quickly. It started out as a birds, but it's transposed into something else. And here in the position, we see b6. Now, the reason I really recommend, in fact, I don't really recommend, I just recommend it straight up, developing on one side of the board first and then starting to think about stuff like b6 usually, is because in this kind of position, white could play bishop b5 check. Here, knight d7, oh, bishop c6, and this bishop is kind of invading our position. Rook b8, maybe d5. I mean, that bishop's just annoying, let's face it. So going back, right, again, we want to keep an eye on that spot because of this whole 3-pawn center, but more generally speaking, we want to play e6 and knight e7 anyways before b6. That way the bishop cannot enter into that spot because we already have a knight on e7. That's important, okay? We always got to have something defending c6. You know, that's not our knight on b8, because this knight's going to block. If we see a check, this knight's going to block. We need to have either a pawn there or a knight there. So this pawn's kind of stuck on b7 until we put this knight on e7 to free up that b6 move. But okay, white misses this. We have bishop b7. I would also say that here, bishop b7 is a mistake just due to the fact that f5 is a push there that white can pull off. Castling kingside. And yeah, the move e5. Now, you know, this kind of position, of course, I want to recommend e6, but with our bishop on b7, it's like f5. It's just tough. It's just tough. We just don't have the numbers there, right? So we see the move e5. White ends up capturing off, and now we have the move of h6, knight c3, bishop a6. I would say in this position, before bishop a6, let's count our development. We got 2 pieces developed. White has 5. We got to develop pieces. I don't care. You could bring the knight out to e7, knight d7, knight c6. We just got to start getting pieces out quickly. That should be our goal. But bishop a6 here, a little bit slow. Knight d5, the bishop comes back. At this point, maybe white plays a move like bishop f4 and just continues to build on their developmental advantage. We instead see the move c4, which is playable. It's not as good as bishop f4, but that's playable. Knight e7 here. Knight f6 check, right? And black's in trouble. Black's in trouble at this point, okay? Because we kind of stunted our development a little bit. We didn't develop quickly enough, and we didn't keep an eye on that f5 spot, right? Which in this game in particular, we didn't see that, really come to fruition. But just generally speaking, that's a good idea to keep an eye on that spot, okay? In this case, bishop takes f6, e takes, knight ec6. e5 is played, white pushing like crazy. Knight d4. Knight d4. I don't mind that move, offering a trade. Right, we're being attacked. We're down in development. Let's start trading down. White takes. They shouldn't do that. White's attacking. If you're attacking, you should look towards, not trading down and just keeping pieces on the board. Of course, as I say that, white is up a point in material, right? They are up one pawn. So that kind of becomes a hard moment, right? Do I trade down because I'm up, or do I just keep everything on the board? Because I would say in this kind of position, generally, this position aside for a second, generally, if I'm up material and I have an attack, I'm just trading down to a winning endgame. I'm taking the easy win anytime. But I would say here, knight h4, I mean, this is just such a decisive attack, attacking like crazy on that g6 pawn. Black's barely developed. I would just keep pieces on the board there. But knight takes d4 is played. On top of that, we do get development and activity as black. But after king h1, white's still better here. They're still up a pawn. They're still winning. Knight c6 is played. Rook f4. Not the best move there. The rook's a little bit awkward. And it actually turns out that, queen d7, good move there from Roger. e6 is played. In the game, we have f takes e6. Actually, queen takes e6 works. And I'm guessing Roger was worried about rook e4. And for a second, when I was looking at the game too, I was like, oh, rook e4, okay, that's not good. But it turns out knight e5, right? We can block. And if you want to play bishop f4, continuing to add pressure like crazy, we'll just take on e4. We're fine. We can play c6, saving our rook. If bishop takes e5, guys, just because there's a piece there, don't take it. If you take that piece, you run into check, you lose your rook. Not great at all. Castle. If the bishop moves, you win that bishop. If the bishop hangs, take it. If the bishop's defended, move a rook over, right? Timing is important. If you take it too early, you lose the pawn on c6, you get checked, get your king safe, then try to win that bishop. That's the way to play that position out. And if the rook realizes, okay, I'm attacked, I'm going to run away, castling queenside, black is winning. So e6, queen takes e6 actually works there. But instead we have f takes e6. White misses bishop takes g6 with check. We instead see f7. King e7 is played. And let me tell you this. Right now, black's losing the game. But in the game of chess, all it takes is one move. I cannot describe that any better than I just did. Or maybe I could, but I can't think of it right now. All it takes is one move. I cannot tell you how many times I have played in tournament chess, and I was playing a good game, and then I made one mistake, and that was it. Or I was dead lost, and my opponent made one mistake, and that was it. That's all it takes in the game of chess. Here, white takes on g6. Roger races down the board. Queen takes d1 with check. White resigns. Next up, we got a subscriber who sent in a game with the username of Off Camera Grind. Respect it. Now, here playing as black, we see the move of e4 and then the 1, 2, 3. The bishop's activating. Now, let's play e6. Let's play e6. Limit that bishop scope. We now have knight d7, castling kingside from white, a6. Bishop f4, knight e7. So far, this is all standard. Now e5, white striking in the center of the board. Now, if white there played d5 in a heartbeat, I'm locking it up. With e5, we have different options there again, right? We got to think about it. In this case, the engine's saying taking's a solid choice. The engine's saying b5 is a solid move. In the game, we have d5. That's actually a good move here. I like this position for black. Here's the thing, though. After bishop d3, we got to play c5. Why is that? Because we have a French defense structure here. French defense structure. But this pawn on d4 doesn't have a pawn supporting it. That means if we take on c5, let's say we play c5 here, and then we capture, a pawn's not going to capture back. And that makes e5 weaker. The moment e5 is not defended by a pawn, it's vulnerable to getting attacked, captured, all that kind of stuff. Like in this case, if white captures back, boom, we're up a pawn. Right? Pawns are the best defenders in chess. So in this kind of position, you can play d5, but you got to play c5 immediately. And so we see b6. What should white do here? White should play knight e2 so that when we do play c5, they can defend the pawn with a pawn. And now if we take, they just take back. And white has a great position. This pawn on e5 isn't worried about nothing, about anything. However you say that. This is very strong for white. So, going back, after b6, white's got to realize, okay, I don't want this to be a French defense where I don't have a pawn on c3 defending my pawn on d4. I got to bring my knight back and solidify that long pawn chain. Instead of that, we see the move of h4, and I would say, here again, c5 is the best move. We have h6. G4 is played again. C5 is the best move. And we see both sides kind of miss opportunities, right, to either go after d4 or allow a pawn to come to c3. But eventually, we got bishop e7, king h1, c5. Great move, best move. The pawn on d4, no pawn can defend it. And once we take it, e5 is going to get weaker, and the pawn on d5 is going to have more leverage because a pawn isn't in front of it. And it's a lot easier to kick out a knight or a bishop than a pawn, because a pawn can't just run away because it doesn't want to get lost. In this kind of position, we see the move of rook g1 in the game. I mean, if we see a move like rook e1 or something, we can play knight c6, right? Just keep adding pressure onto that pawn and just play some fun active chess. With the move of rook g1, we see that same kind of thing. Knight to c6, putting more pressure on that pawn. If a move like knight to e2, right, let's just say we see that, there's different things we can do, including c4, looking to trap that bishop. That's great. In the game here, we have bishop e3, and now capturing on d4. And just as I've talked about, when a pawn on d4 isn't defended by a pawn on c3, e5 becomes weak. And we see that pawn fall. We see the pawn drop. I do think that, queen takes h4 is another really good move there. The engine seems to have a hard time figuring out which one is better. But I like queen takes h4 and knight takes. I mean, both of them are great. I mean, how do you defend that pawn? That's the question, right? And rook g2 is played. We take the bishop. We see e5, d4. I mean, black just steamrolling white in this kind of position. We now see capturing off that bishop. Queen f6. We're just up so much material now. Knight e2, castling kingside, bringing the rook in. h5. We don't want that side to open up. We're up material. We don't want to make this a risky game where we can get checkmated. Lock it up. Play safe. We're up material. Queen e2. Knight jumps in. And now a beautiful move. Rook takes. I might just put a brilliancy on that one. Great tactic. If the knight takes, checkmate, game over. If the queen takes, we take on f3. That's great. In the game, we have queen e3, rook d3, white resigns. Okay, so just remember that idea. And this doesn't just apply to the hippo. It applies to a lot of different openings. If you're playing a French, if you're playing a check pierce into a French, if you're playing a hippo into a French structure, really any kind of position into a French structure like this, where white has pawns on e5 and d4, and you have pawns on e6 and d5. If this pawn on d4 doesn't have a pawn defending it, right, and that bishop moves or whatever, put pressure on it immediately. White just can't get two moves in. You just can't do it. And in this kind of case, right, we don't even have to take on d4. We could play c4. The bishop's trapped. Next up, we got a game sent in from my guy, Robert Drury, who is playing as black here against the move of e4. And we see g6, bishop g7, now the move of e6. And white here continues with f4 and a3. According to the engine, white is not playing very well thus far. Yes, you do have a pawn on e4. You do have a pawn on f4, but this d pawn hasn't moved, and it's not on d4. It's not even supporting the e4 pawn. So according to the engine, we can play d5 here, strike in the center, take on e4, and black has a better game, a substantial edge. I mean, when that pawn falls off, then squares like f5 and d5 are going to be ours, right? They're going to be very easy to throw a knight into that kind of spot. Those light squares are a little bit weak. But all that to say, right, you don't have to do that. You can keep on going with the hippo. And everyone has their approach to that in terms of when to stick with the hippo, when to leave it. Part of the reason I really like the modern defense to start out with the hippo is that, look, if I need to leave it, I can do it pretty easily. All that to say, I try not to. And in most of my tournament games, I get the full hippo, right? I get the Hippopotamus Defense setup. But again, everyone has their own approach to it. Let me know down below if any of you have the DeSantis book, when he talks about the hippo. And I'll be honest, my approach to the hippo is a lot different than the DeSantis take. I think DeSantis, really throws out a bunch of different positions and ways, 6 or 7 different setups other than the hippo, I believe, to, play out depending on what your opponent does. I only have a few of those. Again, if there's a 3-pawn center on the king side, I'll do a semi-hippo. If my opponent plays h4, h5 very quickly, I'll do a semi-hippo. There's different things like that. But overall, I try to stick with the hippo as much as I can. That's just my personal take on it. But everyone has their comfortability. Everyone likes those transpositional ideas that they can get. And in this case, if you get this kind of position and you really like playing d5, you've earned yourself a better position as black. So just remember, you don't have to stick with the hippo the entire game if you don't want to. But okay, we have a6 here, d6. Robert decides to stick with it. Bishop e7. And, going back, right, what I would say about bishop b7 is that white does have a pawn on f4. And this pawn is a threat to f5. Whenever I see a pawn come to f4, my alarm bells start ringing and I'm like, okay, I really need to keep an eye on this square. What I would recommend here is playing c5. Look, white's giving us space. Take it. Drop a knight on c6. Castle kingside. Keep eyes on that f5 spot. That is so important. And you're also keeping great eyes on that d4 square with your pawn, knight, and dark squared bishop. And if a move like queen e1, okay, let's play d5. Let's make our presence felt in the center of the board. If this pawn pushes, well, in that case, we can just fork the bishop and the knight. And generally speaking, if the pawn takes, well, then f5 is going to lack support. So again, that's my approach to it. And I do think that a lot of Hippo players get blasted by that f5 idea. But if you keep your pawn, knight, and bishop all with eyes on that spot, you're going to be in good shape. But okay, we have this move, bishop e7, castling kingside, knight d7. Now, here's a moment where white didn't play f5, but because we left, right, because our bishop doesn't cover that spot, and we have a knight on d7, f5 is very playable here. Now, sure, we could take, and we can capture back with the knight, but we're a little bit underdeveloped. Our queen gets attacked. If we play something like pawn to f6, the bishop just runs right back, and sure, we're up a pawn, but we can't castle now. We can't castle, and the e-file is wide open. This is not comfortable for the black side. If we play bishop f6, white could even throw in a check, even trade down. But at the end of this, sure, we're in an endgame type of position, but knight g5 is played. If we play f6, the engine move, knight e6, and black is in a bit of trouble here. So you really do want to be careful when you see a pawn on f4 about those f5 ideas. But in the game here, we see knight e2, castling kingside, queen e1, d5, striking in the center of the board, c5 here. c3 is played, rook c8, right? This is all pretty standard type of stuff that you can see oftentimes from the white side. White here pushing with d4, and we now see b5 from Robert. Queen h4 continuing to build up an attack, and now knight f5. I like this move, attacking the queen, asking the queen what it wants to do. Queen h3 is played. We see capturing off on d4. And in this case, the move of h6. I do think that h6 is a little bit of a mistake. I think that h5 is better, and this might seem like a huge error due to the fact that white can play g4. But here's the thing. Now g4, it's not just a move that kicks our knight around and makes space for white. We're going to take that pawn. And earlier today, as I film this, at least, I'm not posting this the day I film it, but as I'm filming this morning, I was talking with Walter Reed, right? We were doing a chess lesson, and we were talking about this idea that, look, if you have a queen and a rook on this file, but you have a bishop and a king, all you really need is the f8 square. Like in this case, we could play rook c2, attack the knight. If you want to move your knight, fine. Queen b6, let's say knight takes f5. We'll capture back with our e-pawn to keep this g-pawn in front of our king. That's very important. And let's say something like queen h3, and we double up rooks, right? Let's just say white does knight g5. Obviously, this isn't a battery ram, but whether it's a battery ram with a rook and queen or a knight and queen, all that kind of stuff doesn't matter. The idea stays the same. Now, of course, in this instance, we would take the pawn with check, and we're actually winning. But let's just say we play queen a7. What I want to highlight here is that if queen h7 check, we just move our king over. And it's kind of hard for white to find progress going forward with this queen and this knight, or a queen and a rook especially. Now, of course, you could try something like e6, but again, queen takes d4, and that king's going to be in trouble. But all that to say, right, if you have a fianchetto bishop, just make sure you move your rook. You got to get that in. Move your rook, play king f8, and it's kind of hard for white to make anything else happen, generally speaking. It might look scary, but I just wanted to throw that idea out there. But okay, this move h6 is played, g4, kicking the knight back, f5, white expanding. We see capturing off, and now this move of bishop to b1. The engine move here is knight takes d4, and I'm not even going to try to start to explain what the heck is going on here. I'll try a little bit, but this is not a move I would ever consider. I don't think. Maybe I would, just based on the fact that this knight is, somewhat trapped, right? It can't really go anywhere without being captured. But knight takes d4, white's not even +1 apparently. Okay, if the f knight takes, we can play rook takes c1 according to the engine. Just take a bishop off the board, take on e5, rook e8, and after queen g3, we can play something like rook up to e7. We're down 2 points in material, and somehow black has compensation here. I don't get it. If knight e takes d4, we can capture back on e5, and if bishop takes h6, we can throw in a check, play queen b6, and here play the move of pawn to d4. And this is the way to play for black according to the engine. So you know, sometimes you plug stuff into the engine and it just does not make sense. Okay, I think the first move here with knight takes d4, I could see it a little bit, but especially, I mean, after this move, just going, you know what, I'm going to take the bishop. That's not a move I would find, but okay. Rook takes c1 in the game is actually played. Rook takes c1, getting rid of that minor piece. And then after rook takes c1, we have this move of knight to e3. Okay, rook c3 is played, and now knight d1. That knight jumping all over the place. Knight takes b2. Knight f4 from white. And here again, you know, the engine wants knight takes e5 and it wants queen to b6. Now, this time I can kind of, you know, understand the idea behind it, you know, at least at first sight, because if we play queen b6 right now, putting pressure on d4, which is defended, we lose our knight. So let's sack the knight, then play queen b6. Now there's no knight to lose because we've already given it away for a pawn, and d4 is hanging because the knight's been distracted, right? And if a move like queen e3, we can play knight c4, attack the queen and the knight. If knight takes, queen takes, d4 can be played. And again, this is just one of those computer lines that it really just takes time to figure out what the heck is going on. But it finishes out with black being better. And if king h1 here, we can play bishop takes e5, d4 would check, knight c4 according to the engine, rook e8. Again, guys, these are not moves that I think hardly any human beings would find. But I just wanted to show those lines, mainly to highlight the fact that sometimes in the game of chess, guys, when you analyze your games, you'll look at the engine move and you'll go, you know what? I should have saw that. Let me remember that tactic. That's a tactic I can find. That makes sense why that's a good move. And that's great, right? Take that away. There's going to be other times where you see an engine line and you're probably just confused out of your mind. And maybe someone, you know, that has a better understanding of chess can show you through it. But sometimes they'll look at it too and be like, I don't know what's going on, right? When it comes to the world of chess, cheating in the game of chess, one of the biggest kind of alarms that come up is like someone that's playing 95, 100% accuracy, and their moves are just so weird that they don't make any logical sense. They don't make any logical sense, and even the player themselves, they can't really describe why they're doing what they're doing, right? So all that to say, when we're playing chess as people, we want to have reasons behind what we're doing, and we don't have, you know, depth 250 to rely on. We can't memorize billions of moves, millions of moves in seconds. So, okay, going back. In the game here, we have the move of pawn g5. Now, I do think that this move is weakening to the f5 square. White could have, they missed it, could have played queen f5. Going, you know what, take the knight, I don't care, I'm going to get checkmate. And if we move the rook, check. Now, again, the queen here can't do much by herself. The bishop here is doing a great job of covering the dark squares. The king's covering g8, but there is a knight that's able to jump into h5, and this is disastrous for us. So, going back, white misses that. Knight h5 is played. Still a good move. White ends up capturing off. We have this move of knight to c4, bishop to c8, and white's completely crushing this position. White really needs to sacrifice here. Just break this position open, right? Throw in a check. I only sacrifice if I see a clear kind of win, but this kind of position here, white's intuition can kick in, just checking the king all over the place, taking the pawn, just going crazy, right? Going crazy against the king, and yeah, black's in a lot of trouble right now. Not a lot of play. Active piece, active piece, active piece. This rook can come to f1 very quickly as well. Resignable for black. So going back to bishop c8, we could see the move of queen to h5. Against that, right, we could play something like queen to b6, and that's what we see there. That move, queen b6 is, you know, one of the top engine moves for black there, and that, you know, overall a good find. King h1, stepping out of the way, out of the line of sight from that queen. We have knight f8, trying to play some resourceful defensive chess from robber, defending those light squares. Again, white here really just needs to blast the position open, but we see white, you know, just make a little bit more, you know, thought, give a little bit more thought before taking that pawn. But once they do, h takes g5, and now this move of rook f6. Rook f6, attacking the queen. Rook e6 is played, best move that black has. And here we have bishop takes g6. This is a mistake. Right, up to this point, sure, white could have sacked, white could have went crazy on the king side, but this is the first time where it's like, oh, wow, you actually lost a lot of eval as white. What should white do? Connect the rooks. Connect the rooks. You got pressure on f7. If we take, the pawn can capture back. And, I mean, look, you can move your king to, you know, f8 or g8, but then you're going to lose your knight. Or you could take the pawn, but then you lose your queen. And this is just resignable for black. So, yeah, I mean, white misses that. We see bishop takes g6. This lets us take the rook. And now, right, if you take with the e-pawn, our queen can capture back. White's still better here after bishop takes f7, but white misses that. White throws in a check, and they throw in another check. I think sometimes in the game of chess, guys, it's easy to just keep chasing and chasing and chasing that king, when really we should think about, where can the king run? Where can the king run? How can I win material here? All those kind of questions, right? Of course, if you can keep chasing the king until it can't run anymore, that's great. But just because you're chasing a king out of its spot, it actually doesn't mean you're getting anything done, okay? In this case, e takes f6 to check, rook e2. We see the move bishop to e6, and here white ends up taking. Now, that makes sense. I mean, look, if you want to play something like queen to g8, for example, checkmate, game over. That's it. So, yeah, white needs to be very careful here. If queen h3 stopping the mate, we just snatch off the bishop. So the best thing white can do now is go into an endgame. Bishop d3 is played, knight takes a3, b4, and now black is the one that's fighting for a win. Knight c4, b3, pushing the pawn. Nice idea. And white goes, you know what? That pawn on b3 is becoming a threat. I'm going to play this move of rook to b4, threaten the pawn. And it's good to hear that Robert didn't go with the move of b2. That would be a mistake, because sure, it's close to promotion, but it doesn't matter. Bishop takes c4 can be played. The defender is gone. White takes on b2, and this is probably going to fizzle out into a draw. So going back, knight d2 is played. A great move there. The knight cannot get kicked by the rook or the bishop. The king's too far away. This pawn is very solid and strong now. Bishop e2 here. Bishop f5 is played in the game. I do think that king f5 is a little bit stronger, just because that king is, really activating itself. It can shoulder that king from becoming more active. You're putting pressure on d4. And again, this knight just can't get kicked right now. But we see this move, bishop to f5. In this position, check was played. I think bishop c2 is better, simply due to the fact that this bishop has to run now. The bishop has to run, and then once it does, we can start thinking about activating this king. If you take, we capture back. c4 and b1 are covered, so you are unable to cover us, stop us from promotion. And by the way, if you throw in a check and then you go here, we just block with the knight. We're going to end up with the queen. Going back though, we see check, king g1, king f5, white ends up taking, and king f4, rook b7, and it appears as if both players agree to a draw. Okay, so overall, solid game by Robert. White had chances to win. White missed them. I think, for every rule there's an exception, and I talk a lot about not giving up material for no reason, but in that kind of position, White had such an overwhelming advantage in terms of attacking power and prowess. You can afford to sack a piece for a pawn, right? You can afford that. You got to read out in chess, and it becomes a very interesting game when you see a position that you've never seen before, which, by the way, happens in most chess games unless you've memorized the trap or whatever. That's when it becomes interesting, because you got to think through a position that's never been played in the history of the world, and you got to think through, is this a position where I sack? Is this a position where I need to sack? Or is this the position where, I just hold back and just keep putting pressure? Next up, we got a game played in the Class A section in a tournament held in Reno. Here, a subscriber winning with the black pieces with the Hippopotamus Defense. Let's take a look. This is a pretty high-level game. A lot of good stuff here. E4, we see G6, Bishop G7, D6, A6. Look, you got to play B6 here so that if A5, you can lock things up there. Great move. E6, we just continue with our Hippo setup. Oh, you're going to attack our queen? All right, we'll do what we're going to do anyways. Queen d2, we don't want to let you in h6. What the heck? So we play h6 there, and generally speaking, I'm very careful and cautious of playing g5 if it's not with tempo. Not so much with b5, because b5 doesn't impact our king's safety the way g5 does, because g5 is on the king side, and it also weakens our short side diagonal. But all that to say, in this case, we do get tempo on that bishop. If it's not with tempo, let's say the bishop's there and we play g5, white can play h4 immediately, just going after that pawn. Sure, we can push, but then knight h2. Sure, we can push, but we're starting to overextend our position way too much, right? So that's not what we want to do. But in this case, you do have time to kick the bishop, and then once the bishop moves, f5 is playable, knight g6 is playable, knight f6 is a great move here, attacking that pawn on e4. And white goes, you know what, I'm going to push. All right, knight h5. I love this idea here from black, booking that knight over to the king side, attacking the bishop. White needs to save that bishop. Save your bishop, and don't let your pawn structure get messed up. But white ends up just moving a rook. Black takes advantage. And in this case, we see the move of d takes e5. I do think that castling kingside is a little bit better, just keeping the tension a little bit longer. This is good tension for us, because is white ever going to want to take? No, because we're going to capture back with the queen. And this pawn on g3 is very weak. Usually, guys, I would say take back with the c pawn, and even after that, by the way, we are better in this position. But in this case, queen takes d6. There's such a clear target on g3. Sure, white can push, but then we have rook a d8, a lot of pressure on d4, a lot of pressure on dark squares in general. Like, let's say a move like queen e3, queen b4, why not? This pawn has overextended to a4, allowing queen b4, b2 is hanging. And if you save that pawn, we can remove a defender, guys. In the game of chess, the bishops, again, they're the soul of the hippo. You can use them to take a piece. You can use them to mess up pawn structure. You can use them to remove a defender of a pawn. There's a lot of purposes there, but it's easy for white to forget about that. Rook takes d4 could be played, but bishop takes d4 is better. Since there, you simply got a pin against the queen. And yeah, we're simply winning that position, right? Bishop takes. If white doesn't want to lose their queen, they got to take with the rook. We're going to now capture with the queen. We're out material, trade down, easy win for black. But in the game here, we have d takes e5. White ends up capturing back with the knight. We have trading off. And this is an interesting position here. It's like on one end, I'd rather be black because this pawn on e5 is very weak. On the other end, it's like, gosh, maybe I want to be white because the pawn on f7 is backwards and a big target. All that to say, we see this move of knight to g6. The engine move here is h5, preventing that bishop from ever even thinking about coming to the h5 spot. But we see knight g6. Now white only has one move that isn't worse for them, and that's bishop h5. White finds it. Again, this is a very high-level game. Rook g8 is played, and yeah, in that case, you know, the engine says different stuff, but I understand why rook g8 was played. That's a very playable kind of move. Rook df2 is played, knight takes e5, and we end up seeing capturing off on f7, castling queenside. This rook ends up attacking two pawns, rook d2. Love this move. You got to play actively, right? Instead of just trying to hang on to your pawns all day long, go attack something. Go, you know what? You're going to take my pawn. I'm going to take yours. That's a great idea. White here wisely doesn't start, you know, going into a who can capture off the pawns the quickest race because we're not actually threatening c2. I mean, I guess we are, but our main threat is rook takes g2 with check. The bishop defends the rook, and the king would then be in the line of fire once our rook moves anywhere. So white here plays the best move they could with rook 1 to f2. Better this rook than that one, right? Because which rook is worse? Well, this one is. All right, let's play that. We don't want to use our good rook and bring it to f2 when we can use a bad one and put it on f2. We want to keep our active pieces active. But okay, we see that rook on the first rank come up. We see capturing off, king to d7. And yeah, here, according to the engine, rook d8 is the best way to play this. You know, looking towards rook d2. White should take on e6, in which case we can throw in a check and end up trading down into an endgame where we're down a pawn. It is going to be hard for white to pull through with this. You know, in terms of a win, they only got one extra pawn. The pawns are doubled over here. We have a bishop that's very nice in terms of, you know, stopping pawns, and maybe we could even win depending on how the game goes. There's still a lot of gameplay left here, but with good play from both sides, this is going to be a draw. But instead, we see the move king d7. White ends up going up a pawn. Rook g7 is played. We see the move king e7 attacking the rook. King d6, just slowly trying to activate that king, get it active. King e5. I like the way black is playing this. We're down a pawn, but our king has superior activity as opposed to white's. And white's king is a little bit stuck babysitting that pawn on g4, which is nice for us. Rook f8. We see the move rook to d7, looking to bring that rook to d2. h4. All right, rook d2 check. All right, rook d2 check. Why not? The knight blocks. We see capturing on h4 and bishop takes g2. This is a key moment in the game. And I really want to encourage you guys to think more materialistically when it comes to the game of chess. I have heard it before. I just need to stop worrying about material. I need to stop worrying about being down. I need to, whoa. No, I disagree with that 100%. I think players need to worry a little bit more about the fact that they're down a pawn. I think if you're playing a game of chess and you're down a pawn, that needs to stress you out a little bit more than it does. I think if you're up a pawn, you need to be a little bit more happy about it than you might be up to this point, right? That's general advice overall. I think players overall, oh, it's just a pawn that I'm down. Oh, it's just a pawn that I'm up. Guys, that's a huge deal. That makes the difference in a chess game. And the better you get at chess, the more you're going to realize that most chess games come down to a single pawn advantage. In this case, white. What should white do? Take on g2. Play rook f2. This saves their pawn. And sure, we can play a move like rook e4. We're going to end up with a drawn kind of game. Of course, anything can happen, especially with a pawn on h4 pushing down the board. But if we play it well, we're okay. But we can't take. That's a bad idea because this pawn is the bait. This pawn is the pawn that's going to distract the black king. And I don't care who you are. If you're Magnus Carlsen watching this, which you're probably not, black's losing this. If you're playing against Magnus Carlsen and you're playing white, you should win this position because at some point, this king's going to have to do something. I mean, this white king's just going to keep making progress. At some point, the black king's going to have to come over. And while the king's doing that, we shoulder the king. Completely winning position for white. So king e3 is played, however. This allows black to take on c2. We now see bishop e4. Black's up a pawn now. Black's up a pawn. Black's up two pawns. And it just finishes out with the rook coming behind. And yeah, I mean, black here with, you know, a winning position all of a sudden. Again, this came down to pawns. This game came down to white giving up too many pawns that they didn't have to give up. Black ends up playing rook a3, taking the pawn on a4. And I really like the patience that black showed here, just continuing to slowly advance. We see pawn to a4, pawn to e5, offering a trade. Why not? Rook f8 check, king e4. Beautiful move here. Check, and then king d4. If you want to check this way, block, I make progress. If you want to check this way, I make advancements with my king. That right there, that is a beautiful move. You're not allowing the rook to just check you all day long, right? You're blocking or you're running to a good spot no matter where that rook decides to go. In this case, rook b4. We see continued slow progress. That king is now locked out of that file. King d3, rook d4, and that pawn just starts to push, and here white resigns the game. Beautiful game from the black side. For game number 19, we got my guy Lem, who ended up going with this move of g3 as white, bishop g2, and just goes into, you know, a solid hippopotamus structure as the white side here, playing b4, advancing now. b4, totally playable. You just got to be prepped for a move like a5, which is what we see in the game here. White ends up pushing to b5. Knight b8 is played, kicking the knight back, and now bishop to b2. Really like that move, developing that minor piece, putting pressure on e5. d6 is played. I don't like black's position at all. I think white has a lot better activity. For example, that bishop on g2 is making the bishop on c8 a babysitter right now. And c4, right? This is a good way to make some space. I think in this position, castling kingside is probably something that I would have thought about. Just castle kingside, see what black does. If a move like c6, we can actually play a4 and take all you want. Sure, by taking towards the center, you do have a passed pawn. And the reason we do that, guys, we don't want to take necessarily with the c pawn, because then that pawn on a4 becomes a target and a weakness going forward. But if we take here, we have one single pawn island still. And, you know, sure, again, the pawn's passed, but what are they going to do with it? I mean, we have a rook and a queen here. The bishop is preventing this pawn from moving. The knight cannot move. The bishop cannot move. The rook can only go to one spot, and I don't know why you'd want to move there. And we could even look towards pretty quickly. I mean, you know, rook a2, maybe queen a1, maybe getting the queen out of the way and playing rook a1. The engine likes those kind of ideas, just really putting a lot of pressure on that pawn. And again, b6 in this kind of position, you cannot do it. So very hard position for black to work with all the space that we have. But we instead see this move knight b3. Now this allows black to play a4 and knight c5, giving them space, attacking the pawn on d3. We see this move of queen to c2, bishop g4, and now knight c3, getting the knight out of dodge, castling kingside, and now knight b3 is played. Now in the game here, white doesn't take the pawn, and I'm not 100% why, but what I would encourage you guys with is, look, in a position like that, we really do in chess, right? I already talked about this, but we want to think more materialistically, okay? And I know that sounds weird. Like in life, we're not supposed to, in general, we're not supposed to think materialistically and only worry about material possessions, right? But in the game of chess, having a pawn can make all the difference. Having a +2, a +3 in terms of the material can make all the difference. And you know, it might not seem like a big deal. It's just a pawn, but I promise you guys, when you guys are down a pawn, take that to heart a little bit. Really take that seriously. I mean, you're on the verge of losing the game if you're down a pawn. I'm not joking. And if you're up a pawn, chances are you're winning, unless you know, your opponent played a gambit or they gave it up on purpose or all that kind of stuff. But a pawn or a knight or any kind of material advantage is huge. And in the game of chess, there's nothing wrong with not losing any material, you know, with all of our might, not trying to lose anything. And whenever we can, right, at least, you know, when we're not getting checkmated, taking all the material off the board that we can get. So we really do want to think materialistically. That often decides chess games. In this case, we can take a pawn. We're up a pawn. We're up a pawn. What does black have for it? I don't know. In this case, you could defend the pawn. By the way, I mean, black giving up 2 minor pieces for the rook and pawn, not a good idea. So take the pawn there. Take the pawn on b3. But we see queen to d2. And yeah, I mean, queen c8, right? This is a move that black could play to hang on to the pawn. I'm assuming they didn't do this because they just didn't want to play super defensive chess forever on that pawn. We can still push with a4, a5. Now we're looking towards a6. If rook b8, rook a3, we can pick off that pawn as well. But just a very nice, pleasant position for white to work with. Winning, really. But we see this move of queen to d2. c6, capturing off, and the bishop flies in. So we're up a pawn now. We're up a pawn. Rook a7 is played. Knight b5, active move, kicking the rook around. Bishop to g2, knight c5, and yeah, the game continues here. Again, guys, we want to think in the game of chess materialistically. In the game here, we have the move d4. This gives black material back in the game. And the engine says we're okay here, but I still think from a practical standpoint, guys, we really want to be careful to not give back material unless we need to, or unless we see a clear route to victory. And maybe white did here. Maybe white did. You know, white is better here still, but I would personally just play a move like e4. Keep my pawn advantage. Keep it going from here. Right? You could play a move like bishop to c3. You could play a move like rook fe1. You could even think about f4. There's a lot of moves, but keep your pawn advantage. That's huge. That's so much leverage that you have in the game. And when we play d4, we end up giving some of that up, right? The move of knight a4 is played, bishop a1, queen c8. In this case, what do we do? Well, in the game we have rook takes b3, but then black gets the pawn. What I would, ask here is, look, which one of these pawns is weaker? I would say the pawn on b3 is, sure, it's further down the board, but that doesn't mean it's not weak. This pawn is not going to have any pawn defending it. This pawn on c4, it's still on our side of the board. Here, white could maybe play a move like bishop f1, hang on to the pawn. If a move like knight b6, queen d3, and then, look to capture it off next. If you want to attack again, okay, we'll kick your knight. Then we'll take the pawn. And that's the way that I would approach this kind of position, right? Trying to get my material back. But we see rook takes b3. We end up losing that pawn. Now we're down in material again, and black is better because of it. Rook b4 is played, queen c8, d5 advancing. I actually really like that move, activating the bishop a ton. Queen d7, bishop goes back. Solid move as well, right? I mean, Lamb here is showing a very solid understanding of knowing where to put the bishops. Both of Lamb's bishops are very well placed on f1 and a1. Black's bishop, it's not great, right? h6, knight d4. Great move from Lamb again. Just centralizing that knight. Rook a5, knight c6. Attacking the rook, attacking the bishop. We have pressure on a4. Rook a8 is played. We see capturing on e7. This move, queen d4, threatening a mate in one. And no matter what black does, white's winning here. I mean, we're threatening a mate in one, and we're threatening this knight. Black ends up playing queen e5. Does that change anything? Is black okay now? Well, we're not going to take the queen because pawn takes back, and where do we get our material? I don't know. So in the game here, we see Lamb go with the move of rook takes a4. Great move, capturing off. Look, if the rook wants to take back, we'll capture back with the queen. If the queen takes back, which is what happened in the game, we're not going to take with the bishop and then lose our rook. That's not a good idea, right? Take with the rook. Get it out of dodge. I'd much rather lose a pawn on a3 than my rook. And then from here, we have bishop b2. And this is actually, a winning position for white, right? We have that material advantage. We have two minor pieces for only one rook, which is great for us. Rook f6. And I was told that this was a little bit of a time scramble here. Both sides playing quickly towards the end. And we have bishop takes d6, bishop b2. Pretty standard stuff. Black was probably worried about taking on d5 due to bishop f3 ideas there. King g7, and in this position we have bishop takes d1. I think that here you got to really, again, think materialistically. Any time when you're playing chess, I don't care if it's move 1, 10, 30, 100, think about how can I go up material. If I'm -2 in material, how can I get to -1? If I'm even, how can I go up material? That's huge. In this case, when we capture on d1, black just takes back. Why not get something for this rook and then take on d1? Now black doesn't have a pawn on f7. That's a huge deal, guys. That can make a chess game. And it's just such an easier game for white without that pawn on f7. But okay, we have bishop takes d1, king takes, the pawn's still there, f4, check, king h3, and we continue playing here. Bishop e5 would check. I think here, king g2 is a good way to play this. Just get this king back to a normal kind of spot. If you do get checked, right, it's not the end of the world. You could even play king f1 and let black take that, because we have bishop e2. We're looking towards pushing this pawn, and according to the engine, we have a winning position here. So that's one way that you can play it. Sometimes you do got to give a little bit material back, but we're still up in material here as white, and I think that trying to hang on to everything in this case, right, is detrimental because this king is so awkward. G5 is played, and we now see the move of pawn to d6. Now, what did black miss here? Black missed the win of g4 check, and then rook d2. Rook d2, right? If we move the bishop, let's say we go to like c6 or something, game over, right? And the bishop's hanging. We can't defend the bishop. If we play d7 trying to distract the rook could just go, you know what, I don't care. Make a queen all you want. I'm still going to win, right? So white there is in major trouble. White misses that. White plays the move of rook d2. And this is white's last chance, really, to hang on to a draw. And that's by playing f takes g5. F takes g5, right? F takes g5. The king can take the bishop, and then we have bishop f3, and really both sides just start picking off stuff as fast as they can, but this is going to end up being kind of a fortress in a sense. It's going to be pretty much impossible for black to win this game with these pawns here and us having a minor piece, a bishop just flying all over the place. It's very hard for black to actually do anything against our structure right now. And we're not gonna push like crazy and go for a win here. At least I wouldn't, because our position could get a little bit compromised. Just keep it cool, stay back, and yeah, just go from there, okay? Not to mention that, you know, if let's say we pushed our pawn to g4 and black sacked for that pawn, we'd have a light square and an h-pawn, right? Bishop looking towards a, light squared bishop and an h-pawn looking towards a dark squared h8 spot. Not good. That would be a draw for white. So rook d2 is played. We see this move of bishop to c6, and black now finds the mate in 2, 1, and 2. Again, the end there, time scramble. But overall, I think my lesson from this game, right, I think both sides played some really high-level good moves, but overall, when it comes to the game of chess, we need to think materialistically. I'm not saying never give a pawn back, right? Like, there's a variation there where we did, but if you don't need to, if it's not necessary to give material back or to give material up or to not take material that's there, I mean, you get the point, right? We really need to think about points. And when we talk about material, we're talking about firepower. The more firepower you have on the board, the better. All right, y'all, here we go. Game 20, been a long video. You guys probably have realized my words have been slurring a little bit. I'm just, it's a long video, so apologies for that. But, I've really enjoyed going over these games. I hope you guys have got something out of them. And this last game here is a really nice win as white with the Hippopotamus Defense, or the Hippo attack, if you call it that for the white side, right? Either one. Okay, G3, D5, D3. This is all standard stuff. Black here also goes for fianchettoing both bishops, which makes things interesting. A3 here. I don't know if we need to play that because that pawn's on C5. And I don't know if we're going to play C4 here. Maybe, but probably not. So I don't know if A3 is necessary there. But castling kingside. Now we see knight b7, rook b1. I actually really like this move. I really like it. The other thing that you could think about there is white is playing rook a2. That's also an option that is playable. Of course, if you play rook a2, your rook's kind of out of position a little bit. But it does open up the a1 square for the queen. That's one idea. We also see sometimes queen b1, queen a2, and then the queen coming to a1, forming a battery ram like that, so that the rook's not stuck on a2. Just throwing some ideas out there. These are all things that I cover in my over 6-hour course on the Hippopotamus Defense. But in this game here, we have rook b1. I really like this move because it defends the bishop. Funny enough, black ends up doing the same thing the next move. But let me show you why it matters. Let's say we play a move like f4. And this is particularly when it comes to fianchetted bishops. We're losing. We're dead lost. We're dead lost. That is why rook b1 is so necessary, or rook a2, or some kind of way of defending that bishop. By the way, the only reason I'm recommending rook a2 as an option is because there's no bishop staring at it on a square like e6. The moment I see a bishop on e6, I'm like, I ain't going there. But in this case, we're losing. Our bishop's attacked. And our pawn's attacked. If we save the pawn on f3, we lose our bishop. If we defend the bishop, we lose our pawn. If we take the bishop, intermediate move. Obviously, we don't want to lose our queen. And at the end of this, black can take, play d4. We're down material. We have huge weaknesses in terms of, dark squares that black can try to take advantage of. That bishop is a monster. And it's just a terrible position for white. So you want to be careful whenever you have fianchetted bishops for those kind of tactics. Rook b1 is played. We have the same thing from black. I do want to mention here, f4 also isn't good. It's still losing because of knight g4. Now, of course, in this case, we don't have to take this bishop. We can try to defend that pawn. But now the question is, how do we even do that? Well, we could play a move like rook to f3, right, and defend that pawn. But then, maybe black takes. Maybe black plays a move like d4, and that rook is going to be under fire. Not great, right? So, yeah, you want to be careful about those knight g4 ideas, particularly against a pawn on e3. Again, d3 and b3 are a lot stronger than e3 and g3 are. But let's just say in this kind of position, you played h3, you kind of got that full thick-skinned hippo, and then here you played the move f4. Well, if this bishop wasn't defended, if the rook was here, black could play knight g4, whole idea being takes and takes the bishop. But now if a move like knight g4, we're just like, Okay, we're not taking your bishop because of e3. We're just going to capture off your knight, and our bishop's defended. We're up a piece for a pawn. So that's the idea of defending with the rook. But just remember, even if you defend the bishop with the rook, that doesn't mean you necessarily have f4 available, especially if the knight can jump into g4. But okay, rook b8, black going for the same kind of idea there. And now d4, black ends up capturing. I think here e takes e4 is probably the best way to go. Really stamps down some dark squares. Maybe here we continue with a move like rook e1. c4 is an idea in terms of pawn breaks. But we see knight takes d4. Black misses the opportunity to push with that pawn to e5. And we see knight to e5. And here knight b5 is played. Capturing the pawn, nice tactic. Nice tactic for white. Capture off the pawn, take on e5. We're up material. But instead we have the move knight b5, knight c6. We bring the knight over to the king side, bishop a6, a4 defending it. We see capturing off, knight to e7. And here we see the move of bishop to a3, guys. In the game of chess, what I recommend to you guys is think about what your least active pieces are. You've probably heard that before, right? Find your least active piece and activate it. In this kind of position, is the bishop better on a3 or b2? I'm not totally sure, in all honesty. I actually do think it's pretty well placed on b2, but in either case, the bishop is already extremely active. But what about this rook? The rook's not great. So if I had to activate one of these, right? If I had to activate an inactive to an active spot or an active to an active, I'm making the inactive piece active. If I play rook a1, I'm putting pressure down on that a7 pawn. If I move like queen d7, we can play c4. We can continue with rook a4, rook lift idea, maybe even playing queen a1. We got two battery rams here on the a file and along the longest diagonal in chess, or, one of them, of course, there's a8 to h1 as well. But yeah, a lot of pressure here. Black can play knight h5. If they do that, we take, capture back. So much pressure here. Great battery ram, beautifully placed bishop, and terrible knights for black. You have a fianchettoed knight, which is generally not a great idea. So all that to say, right? Just keep that in mind. I would recommend here that white activate their inactive piece. But we have bishop to a3, queen c7, knight d4, activating the knight, rook bc8. In this case, knight c6 is missed. This is a nice little tactical idea. Putting pressure on that knight. If you capture, take the rook. Take the rook, right? And if you want to capture back, fine. We take on c6. We're up 1 point in material. We play c4. And since we're up in material, and in this case, black doesn't have much to show for it, we're winning. Going back, we have the move bishop takes e7. Queen captures back, and knight c6. c4, beautiful move, making space. If black wants to take, we capture back, and that fixes our pawn structure issues in terms of having double pawns. a6, we ain't taking that. Are you kidding me? We lose our knight. So we see the move of rook c1 here from John. Good move. a5. And now c takes d5, capturing off. Just a great choice there to take material, go up material. Sure, our light scores are weaker, but at this point in the game, it doesn't matter too much. I mean, what pieces can black attack with? The bishop on g7 can't take advantage of that. And black in general is in a very inactive spot, and we're up material, which is great. So queen b7 is played. We see the move queen g5, right? Knight e7 almost works, but then the queen just, kind of takes it. So I guess it doesn't. Queen g5, rook comes over. Now a check works. Beautiful move. I'm going to put a little brilliancy on that one. Great move, right? If the rook takes, all right, we take your rook on c8. And once the queen captures back, or if it captures back, we take on e7. We're up material there. If you move your king, we end up going up material anyways. If queen captures back, which is what happened in the game, we take on e7, capture on c8, and from this point, just such a clean win from John here, doubling up rooks, taking off the bishop, playing rook c6, rook c5, all that kind of stuff. From this point, pretty straightforward. White never let black into the game again. Just hard when you're going up against two rooks. And here black seemingly resigns the game. Okay, so hope you guys enjoyed those 20 games on the Hippopotamus Defense and the analysis of them. Again, thank you guys so much for making this series what it is. Thousands of you guys have followed this series. I haven't made another opening that's hit even close to 100 videos, and you guys have really helped this series stay alive up to 100 videos. Again, thank you to the thousands of you that have watched this series, have liked. Thank you to all of you that have commented. Thank you to the hundreds of you that have gotten the over 6-hour course on the Hippopotamus Defense. I'm not selling something I don't believe in. I play this exclusively as white and black to hit the National Master title. And that's not me sitting here saying, hey, if you get the Hippo course, if you play the Hippo, you're going to become a National Master. I'm not saying that. What I am saying, though, is that the Hippopotamus Defense is very underrated. And if you put the work in, chances are you can get some pretty good results with it, right? There's a good chance for that. It doesn't fit everyone's style, so I'll start by saying that. Some players really like tricky, trappy, open type of board chess. But even if that isn't your style, I think it's good to practice openings that you don't like. I know that sounds weird, but practice openings that you don't like, practice openings that you're uncomfortable with, and you're going to learn ideas. You're going to learn ideas that you usually don't rely on, and that's going to help you in other stuff. Like, for example, the Hippo, there's a lot of different ideas. You can apply it to the Pirt's defense, the Czech Pirt's. You can apply it to, there's some ideas in the Vienna game, right, where we see Hippo ideas. You see Hippo ideas in so many different openings, and you kind of see a melding of different ideas together in the Hippo. And it's a middle game based system. So we're not trying to win the game right away. We're simply trying to get a playable middle game position that we're comfortable with, our opponent's not, and just put in the work and understanding those middle game positions. And guys, there's gonna be games where you get blasted. I'm telling you right now. When I started playing the Hippo, there were games where I got blasted. What do? I go over, I plug it into the engine, and I start analyzing. And then I go, you know what? I'm going to learn one thing from this game that I lost. I'm going to learn one thing about the Hippo. And eventually you learn so many lessons. You start avoiding those mistakes that you used to make, and you get really good at it, right? And that's just not for the Hippo. I think in general, like if you're playing a Kali Zuckertort, if you're playing a London system, if you're playing any kind of system where you're trying to get the same kind of setup, it's very easy to learn and get good at it quicker than maybe something like, oh, I'm playing the Scotch Gambit. Because how often are you going to get the Scotch Gambit? Not that much. You could get it from time to time, but the Hippo you can get every single game, right? So your learning speed, in terms of the calendar, is just going so much faster because you're getting so many more games with it. But again, you don't just want to play it and then, oh, well, I'm losing. I'm going to keep trying without studying it. Study it, talk to a coach, talk to a higher rated player, talk to someone that knows the Hippo well, study it, study the positions. And maybe you're playing the Hippo and you reach a position that's really bad and go, you know what? Okay, where do I need to branch off? I was playing the Hippopotamus Defense. Where do I need to start playing something else in that kind of case, right? Where do I need to, okay, I'm going to play the Neo-Modern. Okay, I'm going to transpose into a King's Indian. Okay, I'm going to go into a Pirt's, right? Where do you want to cross the line in terms of when you play it and when you don't? And again, for the rest of this year, until the end of this year, right? Until the end of 2024, all you got to do, plug in 2024 in the discount code section when you click the link below, and you will receive 30% off on the Hippo course or any other course that you decide to get. Again, the Hippo course, big fan of it. Thank you guys again for all your support for this series, and I'm excited to keep it going. Peace. Guys, I hope y'all enjoyed today's video. And just a quick reminder that in addition to the 30% off all online courses sale this month, we wanted to also give a 20% off sale on our physical merch all December. We got shirts, hoodies, mugs, and more on the merch shelf below, and we got a lot more on the website. So check them out and use the code WINTER20 for 20% off. On top of that, I wanted to give a big shout out to my Patreon supporters for the month of December in 2024. I appreciate you guys a ton. It's been great getting to know you. And I'm just humbled by your support. And if you guys haven't thought about joining the Patreon community before, there's some exclusive benefits that you gain by becoming a member. And I look forward to seeing you over there on the platform. Peace.